What's up, everybody? How's it going? How's it going? How's it going? And welcome to Theory Plebe, the channel, the personal website, the YouTube stream, the Twitch stream, the podcast even sometimes. Yeah, there's even that. What's up, Mr. Red? I am Object. I Zool. And who else we got here? Who else we got here? Anarchist Tech Support. Yeah, welcome. Welcome to Dangerous Maybe.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Okay, well, it's pretty simple. Just somebody who loves continental philosophy and psychoanalysis. And I'm the author of a theory blog called The Dangerous Maybe. It's on Medium. And I'm currently working on my first book. And I'm hoping to have that done within the next few months, hopefully. And yeah, hoping to get back to writing the blog. I haven't been as active on the blog recently because I've been working on the book, but I plan on throwing some new blog posts up there pretty soon.
Yeah, so we're both book buddies right now. We're both brainstorming our books, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yours has been in the works for a lot longer than mine. Mine is my first shitty book for a reason. Yours is like, you're putting more, let's just say you've put more thought into yours. You want to talk about what your journey with philosophy has been like in a quick sketch?
Sure. I'll spare you the little anecdote I always tell because I've told it before many times. But I got into philosophy in my early 20s and slowly but surely developed a passion for it. And over time, it became something I just couldn't stop doing. And I wasn't able to go to school. Bullshit, facticity of life got in the way. And so now the blog and working on the book, those are kind of my ways of engaging in philosophy. And I guess, I mean, my favorite thinkers, it's funny because you were talking about this on one of your last streams. My favorite thinkers at this point are Lacan, Žižek, Baudrillard, Marx. I still love Heidegger. Heidegger is one of my favorites early on. And there's a lot of other ones, but those are primarily the thinkers I'm going to be drawing on in my book. There's going to be some Mark Fisher in there. But yeah, I'm primarily at this point interested in consumer studies. I've always been fascinated by the consumer society, and my current book is going to focus primarily on consumerism, and yeah, and it's not just consumerism for you and me, like, right? It's also just theories of subjectivity, and you can't do a theory of subjectivity without understanding consumerism now, right? Well, yeah, and I think what's interesting with the online culture war, I mean, it's still going on. I don't know if we might be past its peak. I don't know. But what was so interesting about it was all of the isms everybody was fighting over, right? Communism, capitalism, fascism, libertarianism, conservatism, all of these isms. And yet you never found consumerism brought up by anybody. It's almost the one disavowed ism that none of them want to claim, and yet I would argue that it's the most fundamental, for lack of a better ism. It's the most fundamental disposition we have. It's the most fundamental aspect of what structures our subjectivity, our desire, our enjoyment. And so it's funny, the whole online culture war, I felt like what was missing were discussions of consumerism. And it's funny, fascism's not, it would take a stance against consumerism based on its own ideas and principles. Capitalism doesn't really want to own consumerism either. I think that's the most interesting thing, is that the people who are pro-capitalism don't seem to be pro-consumerism, and yet consumerism is actually existing capitalism. Obviously, people with a leftist orientation, whether you're Marxist or anarchist or what have you, you're obviously against consumerism. And so I'm I'm trying to write a book that, as meager as my attempt will be, is somehow situated in this history of philosophers who have focused on consumerism. And arguably the two greatest are Baudrillard and Žižek. And what's interesting is that there hasn't been much discussion or comparison of their work. And I got a chance to meet Žižek. Dave was there too. And one of the things I asked Žižek was about his relationship to Baudrillard. And it's interesting. Žižek mentions about, any philosopher you can think of in the continental tradition. And yet there's very, very few references to Baudrillard. I think I found 2 of them in the 20 books of his I've read. So he doesn't engage with Baudrillard very much. And when he does, it's just, he'll throw one comment out there in passing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was very interested in what he thought of Baudrillard. And I know that he would have certain fundamental disagreements with him because he's a Lacanian, and Baudrillard was against psychoanalysis in a lot of ways. And I love Baudrillard, but I think that's one of his weak spots. I don't think his critiques are all that damning. But Žižek, I could tell, has an appreciation for Baudrillard. And he even told me that early on in his career, one of his friends had given his book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, to Baudrillard, and Baudrillard had sent a message back to him saying that he really liked it and appreciated it. And so Žižek told me, he was like, yes, a book on me and Baudrillard. This is your mission in life. Go do it. And so I've been planning this book, this project, ever since. And, I'm working on it right now. So we'll see how it comes out when it's done. But
cool. So for Žižek and maybe Baudrillard, Lacan was a big deal, right? Still is for Žižek, right?
He's a big deal for all of those French philosophers of the post-war era. Lacan was a towering figure, and whether you agreed with him or disagreed with him, you had to engage with his work on some level. And my thing is, I don't think a lot of Baudrillard has these comments against Lacan in Symbolic Exchange and Death, and I like I said, I don't think they're very powerful. And I say this from a position of humility, but I don't think a lot of those guys really understood Lacan very well. I think they had been exposed to some of his early seminars. Most of them seem to focus on his seminars of the 50s, where he's primarily focused on the symbolic. And, his early work had focused on the imaginary, the middle period focused on the symbolic. And in that middle period, he was showing how psychoanalysis must focus more on the symbolic than the imaginary. Again, we'll get to what these terms mean in a little while. But what they don't seem to focus on as much is the Lacan that Žižek and Badiou and all of these great living thinkers have been influenced by, which is the Lacan of the real, of the last period, of the last, say, 15, 16 years of his seminar, where he shifts away from focusing on the symbolic and now focuses on the real. And so the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, you could say, are his primary categories, right? They're the 3 main areas, for lack of a better term, right? I'll use this term as like a preliminary term to just help people get attuned to what we're talking about. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real are essentially the 3 main fields or areas or spaces of the human condition, of human reality. And so it's the Lacan of the real that's considered the Lacan. Like, you could say that Lacan didn't really become his own thinker until his 11th seminar. You could say that's where Lacan becomes Lacan. And I think a lot of these French thinkers who were highly influential in the 60s and 70s, I don't think they engaged much with that Lacan. They were primarily focused on the Lacan of the 50s, which is all about the symbolic order, language, the signifier, signs, right? It's that Lacan that they were primarily interested in. And so I don't think a lot of their comments really hold up in light of the later Lacan. But
so
yeah, I told you before, I think Baudrillard is at his best when he's doing his own analyses and, you know, working out his own ideas. I don't think his criticism of other thinkers is where he's at his best. So but anyway, this is kind of a side tangent. You know, Baudrillard's not really the focus of this. So
no, it's just that Lacan wasn't always your big focus. You kind of came to Lacan after you've been through a lot of phases, and you've kind of realized that Lacan is like one of these final mountains that you almost have to conquer. Not only because he's so influential on the people you like, but, and by the way, you can hear me all right on this microphone? Is this good?
Yeah, I can hear you right.
Yeah, so this is like, it feels like you've done almost everything that you feel like most called to first, you know, at least read through on a first go, and some stuff multiple times, you know, when it comes to Baudrillard or Heidegger or something like that. But now Lacan, like, you've really been getting into Lacan in the last, I saw you do it last year, I saw you do it the year before. There'd be like a phase where you kind of tackled one of the seminars for really hard for like a month long. And by the way, folks, there's like 22, 25 like seminars.
27.
What's that?
27, depending on if you count the one that was unfinished. I think there's 26 finished ones and 27 if you count the unfinished one. So and
yeah.
Each of them are at least like, at the minimum, they're 200 pages. This is what makes them so difficult to get into, right? We've discussed this before, where with Heidegger, of course, you're going to read Being and Time. Now, you can go on and you can read basic writings and you can read contributions to philosophy and all these other great works of his, but you're going to read Being and Time. With Marx, you're going to read Capital. There really isn't that singular text for Lacan. The closest we get is Seminar 11, but there's still so much that is part of Lacan's conceptual repertoire that isn't present in that book, like the sexuation in Seminar 20, the 4 discourses in Seminar 17. You have the seminar on the logic of fantasy, which isn't even translated. We don't have an official translation, or there's not even an official translation in French of that one, sadly. And so, you know, there's the seminar on the 3 registers that I mentioned: real, imaginary, symbolic. So his concepts are spread out across this sprawling seminar, and like I say, sadly, you know, there's my dream is for somebody to write a secondary source, a commentary on the seminar as a whole, and basically devote 10 or 15 pages to each one of the seminars. So those of us new to Lacan could get this overarching idea of what goes on across the seminar. But unfortunately, that doesn't exist, and something like that would take a whole lifetime of work to be able to pull off. And I'm hoping at some point somebody does it, because it would be immensely helpful. But right now we're kind of on our own, where you have to go seminar by seminar, and needless to say, it's a very daunting task. So
yeah, and I went from being kind of like fuck Lacan, I don't see the point, to being like, I have sort of a wary, skeptical, like, okay, it seems worthwhile, to then, like, you know, now a few years later, I'm just like, well, he's one of the highest on my priorities overall. Really, he is. So
here, I guess, if you want, like, here's my big pitch on Lacan. Why Lacan's worth the effort. In my opinion, I think he's the greatest thinker of human subjectivity that's ever lived. And I know that's a huge statement. It's a huge statement. But, for example, if somebody's interested in existentialism, think about those great works of existentialism, whether you're talking about Being and Time, Heidegger's masterpiece, or Sartre's Being and Nothingness, even Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception, or even Husserl's, you know, more abstract, formal kind of phenomenology, where he's chasing after the very structure of experience and the transcendental ego, at least in his books, the ideas. What they're all doing is essentially putting forth a theory of what it is to be human, right? That's what you get from Being in Time. You get Dasein, which is what he thinks makes human beings human beings. It's his, you know, he would call it the phenomenon of Dasein, right? But we can call it the concept of Dasein, right? It's his concept of what it is for human beings to be the beings that they are. Well, Sartre does the same thing in Being Nothingness with his concept of the for itself, right? It's his theory of human consciousness and human identity, human freedom. And so I was very interested in existentialism because one of the first philosophers I got into was Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard's the same thing, right? He's a thinker of human subjectivity. And due to, you know, his Christian orientation, it's a theory of subjectivity in relation to Christianity, to the Christian God, to Christian doctrine, to Christ, to the blood sacrifice, right? I mean, Kierkegaard is a Christian existentialist, even though he would reject that term. I've always been interested in what is it that makes us human, right? What is it that defines us? What are our ontological structures? And if you're interested in the question of what it is to be human, I think you find Lacan is the most detailed, most nuanced thinker of human subjectivity. I mean, right there alongside Freud and Heidegger, right? I think he is. I mean, in my opinion, he's the greatest thinker of human subjectivity, and that's what makes him worth it, because subjectivity for him is not something that's just isolated. It's not the isolated monastic subject. All of these subjective dynamics that he describes have a complete bearing on our social reality, on politics, on pop culture, on economics. All of these areas of the social field are intertwined with our subjective dynamics, right? And that sounds kind of abstract, but hopefully through this talk we'll be able to flesh this out and give some examples that help make sense of this kind of stuff.
The situation in Argentina is
I guess.
less convenient.
Oh, hold on one second.
We'll have to destabilize their economy, refocus labor class outrage from upper to middle, foster a coup, and install a compliant regime.
We getting raided.
Yes, but you can double time.
Oh, cool.
Lampe raid. Thank you, Lampe, for the raid. Mikey, you've probably heard Lampe on stream before.
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you for that raid. 4 people coming in here. Welcome. I'm Theory Plebe. Just call me Plebe or Theory, doesn't matter. We've got the Dangerous Maybe on for a call right now. It is Jacques Lacan's happy birthday. Thank you for the follows. Thank you for the subs. But if you want to get in the chat that's on the screen, you'll want to go to theoryplebe.com/live. But anyway, so we're talking about how Lacan is a really important theory for thinking subjectivity. But you also said Freud and Lacan are really important for thinking subjectivity, and you said Heidegger, but we don't have to get into Heidegger. We can talk about Freud for a second, because obviously, when I think of the French, there are all these French inheritors of specific projects, and in a certain sense, we have Althusser was considered like the French resuscitation of structural, Marxism. We have Kojève was the Hegelian. Lévinas, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty were all fighting over who would be the Heideggerian. Badiou. What's that?
Heideggerian and Husserlian, right? Depending on.
That's right. Yeah, and a lot of them overemphasize their Husserlian base while really just kind of recapitulating Heidegger's project. But when I think of Lacan, I think of Freud. So can you talk a little bit about...
His body of work is a return to Freud. That's what he thought he was doing. I mean, he even said, I leave it to you, and here he's talking to his followers or his audience, his students. He says, here I leave it to you to be Lacanians. I myself am a Freudian. And so what he's doing is rethinking the most fundamental concepts of Freudian psychoanalysis. And the reason for this is because, in his estimate, many of Freud's crucial concepts and doctrines and ideas had been watered down, bastardized, misunderstood by what he called ego psychology. And this was the primary psychological disposition in America. A lot of the Germans fled Germany during World War II, and they came here, and they brought with them what Lacan considered to be misunderstandings of Freud, and they popularized ego psychology, which is, at the most basic level, the idea that analysis involves the strengthening and the development of the ego, not its undermining. And so,
right,
even a basic introduction to Freud, you're going to be sitting there going, how did they get the idea of doubling down on the ego from him? Because it doesn't seem like he does that anywhere. And yet that's how they interpreted him, which was analysis was all about building up the ego, strengthening the ego. And we can think about it in terms of like building self-esteem, building a good self-image, right? That's how you help people. And it's interesting. I mean, of course, that's if you want to get paid as an analyst, especially in America with our egoistic consumer capitalist disposition. Yeah, you're not going to get paid if you're constantly undermining people's consumer identities. You want to double down on them. You want to affirm them. You want to build them up. And so there was an economic incentive here to go in this direction as well. But
well, by the way, side note, you're answering Eve Roska's question. By the way, Eve, how's it going, man? Good to see you. But the question had been, what was it about the material conditions in France that gave birth to such a blossoming period in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. You know, you could, I mean, that's a huge question, but you would have to go into, you know, it's in the shadow of World War II,
right?
The Nazi occupation. You have the onset of the post-war consumer society, but on a political level, it's the post-war welfare state, right?
Right.
Big distribution, big social democracy, and the arts, the humanities, they were reaping the benefits of that. So that could have something to do with it. It's obviously it's one of those things where when some great event happens, Žižek talks about this, where sometimes it's just unexplainable, where you can do all of the analysis. You can look at the economics. You can look at what was going on with religion. You can do this kind of superstructure, base structure analysis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet you still don't really get why did it happen. And so think about in Germany in 150 years, I guess, before this, right? Leading up, you had Kant, you had Fichte, you had Schelling, you had Hegel, and a lot of people argue this is the peak of philosophy. And yeah, it's important to do economic research on this, right? But I don't think you can ever pin it down to just these economic dynamics,
right?
Or to any dynamics, so to speak. I mean, this is one of these kind of Bedouin events where something happens and it has such massive effects that it forever alters the social space. And you can never truly get behind the causality of the event. Heidegger talks about it too with his notion of the event, where, you know, a new understanding of being, which is to say a new understanding of what it is for anything to be what it is, right? Like the most fundamental orientation we have towards reality. There's no amount of ontic or particular determinations that can account for it. There's something almost causeless about it, where you, like, no matter how many particular causal factors that you say were behind it, it's like they never do justice to the event. And so
I would only add to what you're saying, though, by saying that that bit about the Nazi occupation really is a huge factor, because, you know, the U.S., the whole world was hit by World War II. The whole world was. But yeah. France was specially positioned because it's always been France always, okay, the British were always really prioritized just strict empiricism. So they, you know, you had logical positivism there, you know, but for the French, they already kind of had this sort of, culturally speaking, they looked up to the life of the mind, and they already were inspired by the the cafes, by the salons, by the symposiums that they'd already been doing, like over that had already happened, I think, in the 1900s or the 1800s, and it made a resurgence. Okay, and one of the big factors for the resurgence is kind of like right now how everyone's watching a lot more Netflix because of our material conditions, because we're all, we're finding ourselves with more time because we're self-isolating. In the same way, they were self-isolating because of a Nazi occupation. But when you've got fascists marching down the streets, and you've already got a pretty strong social democracy that just took this big hit, it's like if Bernie won and then Nazis took over. Imagine if Bernie won for a while so that that fervor really gets going, the energy is building, the institutions are somewhat changing, but at least everyone feels like they have a role to play. And then fascists full on invade, and then no one can leave. If you leave your house and join in the resistance, you might die. You've got people who are doing Nazi apologetics or being defeatist and doomer and saying you shouldn't even resist because it's pointless. So that's, and so they were all theorizing social change. They were all theorizing why not kill ourselves. They were all theorizing how do I argue that other people have a moral obligation to join in this struggle. They were all trying to theorize what was the right political economic regime to take the place of these Nazis. And in the United States, we kind of sat on our asses through a lot of all of that. So we kind of came in at the end and kind of took the spoils of war and made ourselves the self-righteous victors pretty easily, because when you've, but we did good. Everyone did good beating the Nazis, but the point is definitely the material conditions factor in there. But turning it back to theories of subjectivity, that's
hold on, before we get there, there's one thing I want to add to this.
Okay, good.
It's completely relevant to this point you're making. So Žižek has this famous example, and it's one of his great examples of ideology. And one of the things he's always stressing is whenever you think you finally hit a non-ideological referent, a non-ideological state of affairs, that's when you're the most in ideology.
Right.
It's those moments that you think are completely non-ideological that you're saturated in ideology. And he uses a wonderful example of this to express the different types of ideology or frame of presuppositions that the French, the German, and the English/Americans have, right? And his example of this is the design of the various toilets in each of these areas. So this is from, he does this 2 places. He talks about this in Plague of Fantasies at the very beginning, and he also talks about it in How to Read Lacan. And I'm going to quote from How to Read Lacan. He says, he builds up to this, and he's talking about how, the English, the French, and the Germans have long been considered the 3 main types of, or orientations of, modern philosophy, right? And so he's going to show how even the designs of these toilets embody this. So he says, Hegel was among the first to interpret the geographic triad of Germany, France, England as expressing 3 different existential attitudes: German reflective thoroughness, French revolutionary hastiness, English moderate utilitarian pragmatism. In terms of political stance, this triad can be read as German conservatism, French revolutionary radicalism, and English moderate liberalism. In terms of the predominance of one of the spheres of social life, it is German metaphysics and poetry versus French politics versus English economics. The reference to toilets enables us to discern the same triad in the most intimate domain of performing the excremental function. What seems less ideological than just taking a shit? But he's saying that even in these countries, ideology is there in the toilet, right? And so the idea is, so he describes these different toilets. He says, in a traditional German toilet, the hole in which shit disappears after we flush water is way up front, so that shit is first laid out for us to sniff at and inspect for traces of any illness. In the typical French toilet, the hole is far to the back, so that the shit may disappear as soon as possible. Finally, the American toilet presents a kind of synthesis, a mediation between these two opposed poles. The toilet basin is full of water so that the ship floats in it, visible, but not to be inspected. No wonder that in the famous discussion of different European toilets at the beginning of her half-forgotten Fear of Flying, Erica Jong mockingly claims that German toilets are really the key to the horrors of the Third Reich. People who can build toilets like this are capable of anything. It is clear that none of these versions can be accounted for in purely utilitarian terms. A certain ideological perception of how the subject should relate to the unpleasant excrement that comes from within our body is clearly discernible in it. And so then he goes on in the other quote, he says, the reference to toilets enables us to discern the same triad in the most intimate domain of performing the excremental function. Ambiguous contemplative fascination for the Germans, the hasty attempt to get rid of the unpleasant excess as fast as possible, the French, the pragmatic approach to treat the excess as an ordinary object to be disposed of in an appropriate way, the English/American. It is easy for an academic to claim at a round table that we live in a post-ideological universe. The moment he visits the restroom after the heated discussion, he is again knee-deep in ideology.
Good.
So, yeah, I mean...
I saw this. This is in the... Doesn't he do this in the Examine Life one? I think he does.
Maybe.
But yeah, the interview, it's a good one.
So, okay. So here's why I'm so interested in Lacan, right? To get back to why I think he's so important. So Marx does his thing, he writes his works, and then Freud comes along and changes the world with psychoanalysis. So in the 20th century, you had all of these philosophers who figured out, hey, we can supplement Marx with Freud and we can supplement Freud with Marx and have a much broader theory of human reality that way, right? And so what they do, they want to marry political economy, Marx, with libidinal economy, Freud. And you get this in Adorno, you get this in Marcuse, you get this in Althusser, right. You get this in the early Baudrillard. D and G are still doing it. Žižek is still a kind of Freudo-Marxist. And so what do we mean by libidinal economy? Well, of course, libidinal refers to libido, which is, it's sexual energy, and we can interpret that in different ways. But what libidinal economy really designates is the totality of our desires, our type of enjoyment, our fantasies, the signifiers that we libidinally invest in. It would involve our symptoms. It would involve all of the things that Lacan and Freud spent their lives analyzing. And so that's what libidinal economy has to do with. And in the clinical setting, right, when you go into analysis, the analyst is focused on those highly idiosyncratic aspects of your desire, your drive, your fantasy. And that's what analysis is all about. But someone like Žižek will say, yeah, but
don't fuck with
drive, fantasy, desire, they're all at work in pop culture, politics, economics, and to truly have a kind of Marxist materialist critique of political economy, it requires taking these libidinal dynamics into account. And this is like how you combine Marx and Freud into one overarching form of critique.
Yeah, so this, I mean, it's subjectivity, it's ideology, it's material conditions, but we can't talk about the critique of political economy without bringing psychology to bear. We have to bring psychology into the picture if we want to talk about human subjectivities, how they form within their material conditions.
Right. And so what Žižek does, he's in this long line of the thinkers of ideology. We start with Marx and Engels, and what makes them who they are as ideological thinkers is they say, look, there are real states of affairs, i.e. they're the material conditions, the structure of the economy. And what ideology does is it gives the workers bad ideas, bad concepts. It makes us misrecognize that real state of affairs. And of course, this is in the interest of the capitalist, because if we misrecognize what's going on, if we have false consciousness, then they're able to control us and justify the power they have over us, right? So that's what ideology is for them. It's essentially bad concepts, false consciousness. And so what someone like Adorno does is he comes along and he's thinking in terms of, well, what ideology does is it has to do with our identity. He talks about this in Negative Dialectics. It has to do with our identity, and it functions to repress difference. And what this means in this case is ideology is what we take to just be the given state of affairs, right? We don't see how it's socially constructed. We don't see how it's determined by all kinds of power dynamics and economic inequality. We just take it to be common sense, right? And that common sense or identity prevents us from thinking that there's alternatives, right? This is kind of, we're getting into Mark Fisher territory here. It keeps us from, in capitalist ideology, for example, would keep us from realizing that there's other ways of living, other ways to structure our economy. It wants to naturalize it and act like that the way a capitalist society does things is essential to human reality. Like there's no other alternative. So that's one way. But then Althusser comes along, and Althusser is actually directly inspired by Lacan. And he takes what Lacan has to say about the ego and what he would call symbolic authority, but we could just say institutional authority. That there's other ways of, and which has to do with the symbolic order. And so Althusser is focused primarily on those two orders that Lacan was interested in early on. So the imaginary, which has to do with the ego and the things we identify with, so on and so forth, and with the symbolic, which has to do with institutions, has to do with language, has to do with rules, law, regulations, prohibitions, authority, social authority. And so what he misses, though, and this is where Žižek takes Althusser's theory in another direction, is he misses the category of the real, the order of the real. And that's where Žižek is an original thinker of ideology, is he takes Lacan's concept of the real and shows how that's even more than the imaginary and the symbolic, more than, let's say, ego, how we identify our conscious identities, and law, which is to say the rules, the prohibitions, the standards, the customs of our society, that the real is what is the fundamental kernel or core of ideology. And what that amounts to saying is, there's a very Marxist way of reading this, which is, capitalism has built-in contradictions in it. There's certain tendencies in capitalism that on their own they seem fine, but they're actually at odds with each other. And so these built-in tensions or contradictions are always problematizing the functioning of the system itself. It's not like there's some exterior problem that has been injected into capitalism and causes it to have recessions and other sorts of problems. It's that there's structural dynamics built inside of it that undermine its own functioning. And these kind of contradictions are, in a sense, traumatic, right? On a social level, they're traumatic because they prevent the full functioning, the full thriving of a society. And so ideology is there to cover over these, what he calls deadlocks or contradictions or tensions. And they're like repressed in the real, right? But they're what govern our society in a fundamental way. And so that's one aspect of how he's an ideological thinker of the real.
So touch on the real and repression and how the real is not the reality. Like, I guess we got to touch in on that. By the way, we've been getting really good questions. I'm gonna let them stack up for the end, though. So just
all right. Well, like I said, if you want to turn to the questions, let me know. Or
no, not yet. Yeah, not now.
Okay, so these three. So they're called registers. They're called orders. but the first one's the imaginary, then you have the symbolic, then you have the real. And they essentially make up the structure of, for lack of a better term, the human condition, human reality. But that's, even the term reality there, as Dave pointed out, is tricky, because what Lacan is going to call reality is just the imaginary and the symbolic. He's gonna see those two as comprising almost an order unto themselves, which is called reality, and he's going to oppose reality to the real with a capital R. And so we have to kind of talk about what the content of each of these registers is in order to understand this distinction between reality and the real. So, okay, the imaginary, Lacan first came to fame because he created an original theory of the ego, how the ego comes into being, and it's called the mere stage. And for Lacan, he thinks that early on in an infant's life, you know, the infant is disorganized, the infant lacks control over its motor functions, its body, it lacks a sense of bodily unity, and Lacan argued that it's in its mere reflection, its reflection in the mirror. He called this image the imago, that the baby goes, oh, wait, that's me, and it gets a sense of itself as a unified being for the first time. That's where it gets the very concept of being a unified being. And it's in the reflection that it goes, ah, that's me. But see, misrecognition is built into this. Alienation is built into this because you're not your reflection in the mirror, right? So identity always involves a fundamental misrecognition. You're always identifying with something you're not, and basing your identity on this misrecognition. The French term is méconnaissance. But that's the mere stage, essentially, is that you lack bodily control, you lack a sense of unity, you see this unified image in the mirror, and you start to go, oh, okay, that's me, and that's where your sense of unity comes into play. And that's the ego, right? The first identification we make is with the imago, with the mirror image, but that is precisely not me. I'm not the image in the mirror. And so this is where there's a sense like the ego is imaginary in the sense that it depends on a fundamental misrecognition, right? You're saying I'm this thing, but that's imaginary. You're not that thing. And so the ego starts to emerge from this fundamental misrecognition and identification with the image in the mirror. So that's where we start to get the ego from. But then Lacan, as he entered his symbolic period of the 1950s, he started to rethink this, and he said, you know, this is too simplistic. What it does is it acts like the imaginary order develops on its own. It has its own intrinsic, quote, dialectic, which is to say its own intrinsic development to it. And by the time he hits his symbolic period, he's saying, no, the development of the ego, the development of identity, it fundamentally relies on the symbolic. And so then he rethinks the mirror stage, and he says, no, for me to actually make an identification with the image, it also requires words, signifiers, and it necessitates the other, which in this case is the parent, right? The parent's sitting there holding the baby in the mirror going, see, that's you there. And what the baby over time comes to see is that there's certain features about itself that the parent enjoys, that the parent esteems or values over other ones. And so it's not just the literal perceptual image, it's certain features or signifiers, right? Because words point these features out, or the signifiers point them out, that the parent talks about. And so now the ego's development depends on this, essentially this gaze from the other, which is the parent, which the parent embodies the social order. It embodies language. It embodies culture and custom, right? Those of you who know Heidegger, it's the Dothmann aspect to the parent. The parent is, the parent carries this generic aspect of society within them, and it's through this that the child will eventually assimilate into the social order, the big other, Dothmann.
So Dothmann, you could roughly say it's the public, it's the average everydayness, it's the it's So big other
practices, norms.
Yeah, and I like the example that I think. So I've read a couple of the introductory sort of texts. Mikey, if you're asking how to get into Lacan, Mikey always points you towards secondary texts, and this is the only thinker that he'll do that with. But I will say though that okay, I would personally just read Michael's blog, The Dangerous Maybe blog. I would read his article on objet petit a. We can turn to that in a second. We'll get into it because obviously that's a very popular concept. A lot of people have a lot of trouble with it, and your blog post on it is one of the most popular things you've done, or if not the...
Yeah, it's the most popular. And I mean, and the reason it's that concept in particular is so important is Lacan himself considered it to be his greatest concept, his greatest contribution to psychoanalysis. He doesn't think you find a correlate to it in Freudian psychoanalysis, so you could say it's his key concept, and so that's why Lacanians put so much emphasis on it.
Okay, well, we can come back to that in a second, but I just want to use Lionel Bailey's example from understanding or reading Lacan. It's actually available on Audible, and I listened to it twice.
Wonderful introduction.
It's a great introduction, yeah, and I know a few professors who've read it too. But one of the examples that he uses is like when we're talking about the development of an ego, the development of the sense of I-ness, which is kind of like, you know, you've got your primary caregiver, you've got whoever else is in the household, and there's parts of you that they encourage or discourage, and there's like the whole kind of like you're being repressed into this shape, almost like cookie dough being put into a shape, right? And but a big part of it is that, you know, you're able to control certain things. You learn how to control when you shit and piss. You learn how to control, sometimes there's an ability to control crying. Most of the time, obviously, part of being a baby is you have no control over this stuff. And then over time, you're basically being forced to learn how to control these things. And it's a traumatic learning experience for everybody involved. Obviously, the parents are hating it. The kid is hating it, because when you got a baby screaming at 3 a.m. and nothing you try to satisfy that baby with is seeming to help, it's one of the worst things ever. Well, but one of the examples that he uses of how that subjectivity forming is gaining a sense for the big other, which I'll just do big O for now. We got big other over here, is when they use the example of mama saying, I know I can't though, I have to go to work, right? And through a series of interactions like this, it dawns on the consciousness of this forming subjectivity. There are outside forces that they account to. So first of all, I was reliant on these people, and I thought these people were God and could do everything. And now I discover they actually can't do everything, and they're afraid of other forces in the world that they themselves have to answer to. Mm-hmm. And language and all of the etiquette and ethics and stuff that we learn is all kind of like the basically bureaucratic acrobatics for being able to navigate the big other.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I've got it. I want to touch on Lacan's concept of the Oedipus complex, which is we're already kind of there, right? But we'll come back to it in a minute. But one of the key aspects.
Can I preface it before you do it? Because okay, so we're gonna get into that before we do objet petit a. Look, people who are big nerds for philosophy can just turn their brains off the moment they hear Oedipus complex, and people who aren't into philosophy at all, who've had like a psychology 101 sort of brush past Freud. Maybe they spent one day on Freud, maybe they only had like 5 minutes with Freud. It sounds cartoonish, and Freud himself has been made a cartoon, right? And so maybe talk about Lacan's resuscitation of that, and then use this as your example. But you know, we better address it.
Yeah, I want to come back to the Oedipus complex in a minute, because we need to flesh out these orders first to make sense. But I will say this about it right now. So the later Lacan basically drops all talk of the Oedipus complex. But the Lacan of the 1950s, the Lacan who was focused on the symbolic, he rethought the Oedipus complex. And so the way he rethinks it is, look, the mother's not a literal person, right? It's not. It doesn't have to be a biological female, right? The way that, you know, there's a certain gender essentialism that seems at play in how people think about the Oedipus complex. But for Lacan, the mother is the primary caregiver. Well, that could be a guy. It could be two guys. It could be, you know, it could be whoever, right? Those kind of features, you know, don't matter. What the mother is a function. What the father is a function, right? And so it's not one's biological reality that determines whether or not you're the father or the mother in the scenario. One's biological mother could be the father, and one's biological mother could be the father.
Right.
And vice versa. Maybe I got
who's the obsessive and who's also the primary caregiver? Like, those are two things that would have to link up to
so
make
if your
it.
dad is your primary caregiver,
Right.
then your dad's your mother. And if your mom is the one who breaks apart this unity between you and your father, then she is the father in this scenario. And so he broadens out in this kind of functional way who the mother is, who the father is, and so on and so forth. And so we'll come back to that, right? Because I want to flesh out these other concepts first, and then we will come back to the Oedipus complex because there's more to say. But I'll just say that what he essentially does is he gets rid of the essentialist, literalist interpretation of the Oedipus complex, and he presents a structuralist concept of it, right? Which, instead of it having to be literal biological types or literal social types, it is a matter of social functions that define the Oedipus complex. And so, okay, we've talked about the imaginary. I'll just close with saying a couple more things. So he ends up coming to make this distinction. You have your ego, which is your basic sense of self, and that ego is actually, the content of it is not some pure element in consciousness, like, you know, some pure Cartesian ego. It's a collection of images, right? And again, those images make up your fundamental sense of identity, and yet you are not those images, right? So there's misrecognition involved. But what Lacan will come to do is make another distinction. So the ego is also built around the ideal ego and the ego ideal. And so these are aspects of the ego that he builds onto the concept of the ego itself. So the ego, the ideal ego, is that idealized image of yourself that you have. We all have some sort of image or images in our head of how we'd like to be, and we aspire to realize those images, right? And so these are the imaginary.
So ego ideal is me. I'm
your
in this
idealized image of yourself.
Okay, yeah, it's like I teach and I organize and it's like this whole thing that I want to become, that I'm working on becoming.
It's ideal, Dave. It's the self you yourself think about and want to become.
Okay.
And it's imaginary because it's an image. It's a literal product of your imagination. Mm-hmm. And so it's in the imaginary register, along with, I mean, of course you have your basic imago, the basic reflection in the mirror that you base your identity off of. But then you have this more private, idealized image of yourself in your imaginary register, your imagination. Mm-hmm. But here's the key trick, and this is where Žižek talks about this in Sublime Objective Ideology. What we miss out is that there's a more fundamental aspect to our ideal ego than we realize. We think we just spontaneously want to be this ideal image of ourselves out of, I don't know, just personal preference or a personal choice, right? But what Lacan and Žižek show is that the ideal ego is always based on the ego ideal. And the ego ideal is that gaze, or that gaze with its set of values, for whom we want to be our ideal self. We want to be our ideal self for some other, the desire of the other. Or and that other has its own its own set of values. That's what makes our ideal ego precious to us.
So your ideal ego is the thing you aspire to be. It's the image of yourself but that's like a key to unlock the desire or the affirmation or the recognition of someone else or some abstract other.
Imagine a teenage boy, to take a straightforward example. This kid wants nothing more than to be a superstar athlete. Spends all his time wanting to be the superstar athlete, and he's convinced that, oh, I've just made this choice. This is who I want to be. But growing up, he was constantly bombarded by his father's failed aspirations to become a superstar athlete, and it's the father who structures his ideal ego. The father's valuation, privileging of being an athlete, is the system of values, the gaze, right? Because we can talk about gaze in a little bit, but it's the father that structures the ideal ego, and it's the father in the symbolic capacity. It's his values, right? It's not images that make up the ego ideal. It's basically a set of values, right? And more importantly, it's a gaze that looks at you from the perspective of these values. So the ideal ego is the image of yourself in your idealized form, and the ego ideal is the gaze or set of values you want to be that idealized self for. And so our fundamental identity is always geared towards the other. When people tell you, oh, I'm just going to be me, I don't care what other people think, it's bullshit. You care about what some other thinks. And that's the fundamental aspect of where you got to go to critique your identity, right? It's not enough to break apart your idealized image of yourself. You have to go to the root core of it, which is those fundamental values, that fundamental valuating gaze for whom you want to be that idealized self. And so
I think Brazilian picked up on my drawing. I'm not sure.
I haven't seen it.
Oh,
okay.
I just gave the dad a giant cock. So.
Oh, I see. Good. You have the Borromean Knot there.
It's the phallus. This is the phallus. But, it's not the real phallus.
Hey, the phallus is not the literal penis.
It's not the literal. Okay, that's a big part of the salvaging of the Freudian project, is that, for this is not literal shit, right? This is, but okay, so
we'll talk about the phallus in a minute. So
really quick, so what I did was I did a person imagining a trophy. It's them winning that trophy, and then if they won that trophy, they could get the respect of, in this case, it's daddy.
Yeah.
Daddy, it's not dad who's the ego ideal. It's daddy's gaze of respect. You want the affirmation and respect of this person. And the thing is you could also, and so a lot of people in their like critiques of this whole kind of thing, I've heard it like out, people just spit it out like mid conversation. So it always comes up is like, there's no like one formative instance like this. And it's like, well, they know that. They're not saying that. Like the mirror stage doesn't happen all at once. It happens over happens over a period of time. And this development of a oh wow. Thank you for the donation. This thing, this force out there of affirmation, respect, recognition that you desire. You desire the desire of the other. You desire Absolutely. You desire the affirmation and respect and recognition of the other.
But you also desire what the other desires.
And you desire what the other desires too. Like, yeah, and or because you fucking hate your dad, maybe you desire whatever the opposite of what your dad desired, right?
Exactly.
And so
his desire is causing yours, but you're opposed to it, so it's still ultimately determining yours.
Yeah. Okay.
And so I'm looking at, you've got the Borromean Knot for people in the chat. This is one way that Lacan symbolizes his three registers. Dave, the one thing I would say, cross out ego ideal. Ego ideal belongs in the symbolic.
Ego ideal?
Yeah, or you can put it, see in the space where they intersect. Ego ideal would belong in the overlap between imaginary and symbolic. See where you have reality?
Right there. I did it.
Yeah, it's determining your ego, which is in the imaginary, but it's also a set of values, right, which are rooted in the symbolic. So it would go in that intersection there. And you could also write the big other in the symbolic.
Good. Good to know. Okay, good. Okay, big other, which means I'll go ahead and take it off of right here.
If you want to write something above the bar for ideal ego, just write ego.
Okay, there we go. So. By the way, Roska had asked in the site chat. By the way, folks, welcome to the show. If you're coming from Twitch or YouTube, go ahead and head over to www.theoryplebe.com/live. Don't subscribe to me on Twitch. You're free to make a super chat on YouTube because I really won't see a lot of the stuff that's happening on YouTube or on Twitch today. I'll check in every once in a while, but ultimately I prefer getting donations and subscriptions through my personal site because Bezos is taking 3 out of every $5. Fuck him. YouTube has played a ton of ads on my stuff for a year and a half, never gave me a check. They terminated my account for 2 months. I don't trust them at all. So I'm ultimately, I'm demonetizing all of my content. I am officially revoking my affiliate status, even though Twitch won't let me off. We'll see if they first cancel my account or if they just, because I've been tweeting at them. I've been sending them emails. They won't get, but anyway, point being, I have my personal website. That's the chat that you see on the screen. You're welcome to join it. You're also welcome to just hang out in whatever chat you're in. You're free to do whatever you want because you're free, assuming you're a human being. So, but Roska in the live chat had asked, you're going to love this question because this is about Twin Peaks and it ties into the imaginary, which we're still not off the topic of that. So that's good. And Brazilian, we're going to get to a bunch of your questions because you've asked lots of really good ones, but, where's Roska? Has anyone seen Twin Peaks? Is Bob a viral imago?
Wow, that's a question right there.
I told him you'd like that question.
Oh, I love it. I love a question like that is immediately great, and yet I have no scripted response to. That's a question that really would make me have to think. No, I think, of course, Bob is represented as this image, right? But ultimately, Bob, the entity, would be in the real, right? What Bob does is shatter our sense of reality. And so just like Freddy Krueger or any of these horror icons, any kind of explosion of some sort of real thing that shatters our sense of reality. I mean, coronavirus has largely been sent by the real. I mean, I don't mean to put it like that, but we didn't see it coming, and yeah, we had some basic ideas. Pandemics happen from time to time, but when it actually hits, it just breaks down the very structure of our reality, and we're all left dealing with this trauma that the real has, it's exploded into our reality, right? So, whether we're talking about what Bob did, especially to Laura Palmer, right? But also to the cops and the other characters in Twin Peaks, but especially to Laura Palmer. Bob is on the side of the real, yet Laura's life prior to Bob is in the imaginary symbolic, right? That's her social reality. But then this thing intrudes upon it that breaks it apart. And this is what real life trauma does as well. But Žižek has talked about this, and other Lacanians talk about it, where horror movies are a great example of this, where whether you're talking about a demon or a ghost or a monster, or something like Freddy Krueger, once this thing erupts into your life, you can't, like, your whole world is shattered, right? You don't even know how to begin to put your world back together again after this traumatic real has shattered it apart. And so, yeah, I mean, I totally understand why we would associate Bob with the imaginary insofar as he is this image, but that's really the only way they had to depict him. More than anything, he's a formless spirit, right? He's a demon, and so yeah, Bob as an entity would be the real. He'd be registered in the real.
One thing I loved here in chat was that Sober Cookie was like, that's the thing that pissed me off the most growing up and having low self-esteem. People telling me not to care what others think. Like, how do you even do that? And I would just add on to the top of that when people say, just be yourself. No fuss, just be yourself. Which is like a total American ego psychology, self-help presupposition in the first place, that you have a self that you can be. And people who feel like they have this secure, substantive sense of self, that can be a lot of fucking delusion at work. And the more Lacanian approach, or perhaps we might just even say the more French approach. I mean, hell, you could also say this is like a more Buddhist approach, is just to accept that there's not a fucking Heidegger as well. There's no fundamental you. You might be like, look, I'll never fucking eat spinach as long as I live, or whatever. Like, there might be things about you that are particulars that are part of your identity with how you mediate the world, and that's fine. But this idea that you have a substantive ego, that it's a real thing, and that it is the key to unlock all the blessings of capitalism, if you could just find yourself, own yourself, be yourself, then capitalism will work for you.
Act rationally in relation to the market.
Right. Exactly.
No, I mean, this is why you and I, this is where one of the upshots of theory, one in particular, especially for us Americans, is that it totally destroys the very presuppositions of libertarianism with that rugged individualism. You're not a pure individual. First off, you're not thoroughly rational. You never can be, because you have an unconscious. Who you are as a person in society is completely mediated by your relations to others. This is why Heidegger devotes an entire chapter in Being and Time to being with and to Dossmann. There's a generic aspect to yourself, and if you don't have that generic aspect, you might as well be a fucking alien. You're not going to be able to have any place in society at all. You have to be generic in order to be a human being. Not only that, any identity that you want to occupy, that you want to work towards in society. Say you want to become a teacher. Well, you try being a teacher without students, right? What does that even mean? Like, this is what Heidegger showed, is that to be a baseball player requires other people, right? There's other players, there's opponents, there's teammates. To be a teacher requires students. To be a student requires having other teachers, right? So this idea of just the pure rational ego that libertarianism is built upon is a complete and utter fiction. It's bogus ontology. And this is the thing that you get with a lot of the libertarian types, the pro-capitalist types. It's not a coincidence that they don't have strong ontological theories, right? Yeah. They just presuppose an ontological form, which is, the rational ego, right? But they don't prove it, and you're not going to, right? This is whether we're talking about psychoanalysis, whether we're talking about existentialism, they all work together to undermine this myth of the singular ego that can function in a totally rational capacity.
Well, they're all only slightly more sophisticated than a fucking Ayn Rand, who's, generally speaking, everyone sees as pretty base, not based. But, if you read her What is Philosophy, which I haven't read, I haven't been subjected to too much of her crap. But, yeah. At the time when I was new to philosophy, and it was her, I think it was some essay about what is philosophy to her, and I did read it because I was reading her in a class, and it was like her epistemology is her explanation for what objectivism is. It's like, you show up on a planet and you're trying to figure out if you can breathe the air. Like, all of the forms of analysis that you're going to have to do are part of figuring out objectivity, and philosophy is just figuring out what those things are, like how the forms for all of that, for having those clear thoughts, which is also, you'd probably get the same thing from Bertrand Russell, right? But she takes that fundamental egoism as she takes it a little bit further with its capitalist insinuations as an individualist. But But the thing that she does is the same thing that Heidegger does, which is she's her point of departure is adults, not, you know, this whole like, yeah, no, you're, you know, Heidegger's right that we're always already thrown into a world of others and language, and that we don't have our own language and we don't choose our relationships and all of this stuff, right? Like, so that's there with Heidegger, but there's no development. And this is something you always bring up when in our personal conversations, because I've got a lot. I know Heidegger a lot better than I know Lacan, and I like all of my existentialists, right? And you're like, yeah, but development factors in. And for me, what that has become to mean, oh, sorry, you're all muffled, but what that's come to mean for me is just this idea of subjectivity and subjectivization, as they talk about it in the French. Why it's so important, and why it's not the same thing or reducible to just an ego or an identity, is that the subjectivization of the libidinal forms of energy, of your desire, of your interests, of all of these different things, like they become you in a way that's really fucking hard to break. And so this is all in the background with my newest video essay. And when one of the questions Brazilian physicists asked, and this is too much to get into in this moment, but just like the relation between that libidinal energy and time energy, I'll just say this, that I'm constantly thinking that question. I can't not think that question whenever I read anybody talking about subjectivization or libidinal economy, because it's always like, it is related, and exactly how it's related, it's not fully fleshed out. So,
well, yeah, but I mean, that's what you're working towards. I mean, that's right. What the energy aspect, I mean, it has to do with libido, right? It has to do with that sort of thing. And so to take the time aspect, which of course the existentialists are focused on time, Lacan, you know, there is a theory of time operative within his work. There's a new secondary source that just came out that attempts to break this down, but it's a very logical theory of time. It's not our first person existential I'm concerned with the world, projecting myself forward onto the, you know, the projects I want to realize. It's not that kind of temporality, but yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, how have we talked about it before, where focusing on time energy is a way to, in a sense, marry Heidegger's work with Marx's work, because energy has to do with labor power. But think about what D&G do in Anti-Oedipus. They connect labor power to libido, right? That's how they combine Marx and Freud. And so there's already a way that the emphasis on energy from Marx on labor power connects. There's already, like, the groundwork's been laid with thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari, who connect that. And then they connected Nietzsche with will to power, right? So the energy side connects these, like, this great cluster of thinkers like Marx, Freud, Lacan, Deleuze and Guattari, and Nietzsche, and the time aspect connect Heidegger, Sartre. You could even say Husserl, right? You could, you know, this whole this whole existentialist tradition. So, well,
and why we don't have either one, why we don't have the two together, you know, in their beautiful original wholeness. You know, that is fundamentally a communal thing. It's a communal thing because other people have it to pool as well. The reason we don't have that, you find in Marx, because within the gaze of capitalism, time energy is labor power, which means that we spend our lives trading away the future to pay rent, basically. So, and then we never have time energy, so we're left with energy without time and time without energy. So you know, and I've got 2 essays on that. So to the new people, check it out on the YouTube, on mine specifically, you can find it there. So, but yeah, this is something I'm thinking a lot about, because that subjectivization, is a really big deal. And for me, you might have noticed, if you've seen those essays or ever heard me talk about it in passing, I usually throw attention in there as a sort of after effect. I'm like, time, energy, and attention. Time, energy, and attention. I always say that, but why do I say that? And it's like, I haven't really sat and like worked this out rigorously, because I'm still like, you know, it's a work in progress, obviously. But the attention is necessary to be able to give attention. You have to have attention. You have to have the potential for attention to be able to give someone else attention, right? If you don't have the time energy to give attention to someone else, then how are you going to get to know them over time and then give them recognition? And so, so you need to be able to give other people recognition, and you need to be able to win recognition from others. But right now, the only kinds of recognition you get are superficial forms of recognition, either online, or super institutionalized forms of recognition, like, oh, you ran for office, or you got this raise, or you promoted in a business, you started a big company that was successful, whatever. Those are institutionalized forms of recognition. But the kind of, like, if you were in a community where you knew everybody, like there's 150 of you, and that's society for you, then you know what gets recognition in that context. You know what can get you. There are avenues towards the fulfillment of recognition, and you have the time energy to give other people recognition over time as well. Because recognition is not something that can be given, oh, I affirm your identity, now we're done. No, recognition in the sense that we're using it, you and I, is going to mean, like, it requires sustained effort of committing yourself to getting to know that other, or at least it could be, for instance, maybe I don't know you from anybody else. I don't know you at all, but because I've studied philosophy now for a long time, and then I hear you talk about philosophy, because I've studied philosophy long enough, putting in that sustained effort, I'm able to, like, you're saying things where I'm like, oh, I'm cluing into it. You know more about this than me. Oh, now you get my recognition there. And that's not something that there are people with doctorates, I wouldn't give them that recognition. But think
about what you just said, though, right? This all plays into the dynamic between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, right? What you're saying, for me, as or let's just say the ego, right? For me, to get recognized by others, right? To have my identity confirmed and validated requires that I'm playing by the rules of the ego ideal operative in my society. There's certain sets of values that we all share, and if you don't share those, you're not going to get recognition, and because of that, it's going to lead, if you're not recognized by your peers, the others around you, that's going to lead to all kinds of issues, right? And this is what the infant is constantly dealing with, is if I don't please the other, if I don't please my parent or my primary caregiver, this is going to be bad for me. So I have to be the way the other wants me to be in order to sustain my very life, right? In order for me to have any sort of comfort or pleasure, I have to be what the other desires. And so there's these different aspects, right? There's the parent as an imaginary other, which of course the parent has their own specific set of identifications they've made. There's images they identify with that they go, oh, that's me, right? But there's also the other aspect of the other, which is their symbolic values, their symbolic aspect, which these are the principles, values, rules, standards, norms that I live by and that I accept as a participant in my society, in my symbolic order. And then there's the real missing part, which is the real aspect of the other, which is the other's desire. You can never be sure when it comes to what the other desires. The other can tell you what they want. They can make a demand on you, but you're never absolutely sure that's what they want. Why? Because your parent has an unconscious too. They're not completely unified within themselves. They're a split subject. They're a divided subject between ego/consciousness and their unconscious subjectivity, right? And so the desire of the other is this very menacing thing, because even if the other tells you what they want from you, you never can fully rely on it. There's always an opacity, always a mystery to the desire of the other. And that is what that's kind of the aspect of the other. We'll come to see, this is what Heidegger calls the thing, das Ding in German. And it's that unknowability in the other, right? It's close to what Levinas was talking about with the otherness of the other, the alterity of the other, right? Where no matter how many concepts you have, you can never master the other. The other has this infinite dimension. Well, this is Lacan's way of thinking about it. It's to talk about the desire of the other, or das Ding, the thing, right?
So I've got das Ding. I've put it in the real real register.
Yep.
We've got. Okay, so we got the real. There's going to be folks who don't have eyes on the whiteboard. None of this is actually essential, but just understand that it's a sort of Venn diagram where you've got the three circles. It's real, symbolic, and imaginary. That's the three circles. And I've put in the imaginary one the mirror stage, which is that whole process of becoming vis-a-vis the primary caregiver and whoever else is in the world in your life at the time that you're coming to consciousness.
You recognize yourself through a fundamental misrecognition.
Right.
You're not that imago.
And that fundamental misrecognition, the product of it is that ego. And that ego, it divides into the ideal ego, which is still in the realm of the imaginary. But then the other part is the ego ideal, which is kind of in that piece between the symbolic and the imaginary. Now we move over into the register of the symbolic. That's where the norms, the rules, the laws, the language.
Yes.
And that stuff is the conscious stuff, right? And then we got the unconscious stuff that runs counter to that includes desire, COVID-19, class war. And das Ding, right?
Yeah, Bob from Twin Peaks.
Bob. We'll go ahead with Bob here.
And so here's the thing I would say, right? We have to pay close attention to how these orders interlock, right? That's the whole thing. This is not a straight up Venn diagram. It's a Borromean knot, which is to say, if you look at it, like if you Google Borromean knot, you'll see that these three circles are actually interlocked. It's not like you can separate them. They're all linked together like a chain. And if you were to break that, you would break apart the psyche. I mean, that's another way to talk about it. Again, it sounds too much like ego psychology, but those three registers, you could say, make up the psyche, put it in quotes, the human psyche. And so, yeah, those are the three primary registers. Let me see what we have. So
I've returned the dick to the screen because Sour Cookie was like, no, the dick, because I had erased it. And I just, okay, so while you look at that, though, we've got the kid who wants the trophy. And that's the ideal ego is the one who could get the trophy, and that's what you're fixated on in the when you're a kid and you're like, I want to be this, I want to be that, and maybe you're like, fuck dad, I want to have whatever music on my wall dad would hate, right? Like, but whatever it is, you're kind of building your ideal ego. But there's part of it, like, you basically want to win someone's respect. You want to win someone's recognition. Maybe there's no one person, but it's a general sense of there is respect out there that I could gain. And so this is your ideal, your ego ideal. But the ego ideal has rules for recognition, and you're trying to learn what those rules are. And maybe you're trying to learn what those rules are by breaking some of those rules.
Yep.
And then in returning the dick, I accidentally, and this was a fortuitous occasion, put the penis on the word recognition. The head of that ginormous phallus is resting on the R for recognition, which I then put an arrow. I say not real. That penis is not real. But the phallus, it basically, the phallus is that force of recognition and power. The power that has recognition, the power that can give recognition. Am I right?
Okay, so one of the most difficult concepts is the phallus. When you get into Lacanian psychoanalysis, this will drive you crazy, because for Freud, the phallus was just the penis, right? It was the literal organ. But just like Lacan takes the category of the mother, the category of the father, and functionalizes them, the phallus now becomes a, quote, signifier, which is to say it has something to do with language, with symbolic rules, practices, norms, and it's not limited to an actual biological organ. And so what the phallus essentially, again, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because it really has to do with the Oedipus complex and then with sexuation. But, and I hate it. I hate when Lacanians just go, well, the phallus is a signifier, or it's a signifier. It's so unhelpful.
Yeah.
But I just want to touch on a few other things before we circle back to this. Yeah, we'll get back to this. So just to close out our discussion of the imaginary before we flesh out the symbolic a little more, and then we'll get to the real. Okay, so the other thing that we want to talk about that is, you could say that it would belong in the imaginary and the symbolic. It's the unary trait. And the unary trait, Lacan seems to use it in different contexts for different purposes. But this concept essentially goes back to Freud's work on group psychology. And so Freud's idea is that when it comes to group cohesion, usually a group is centered around a leader, and the group identifies with some trait in the leader. And this trait, it really helps us understand how ideology works, how group psychology works. And so the funny thing is, what's interesting when you look at like the empirical research of this, when we identify with a leader, we usually don't identify with some lofty norm, some lofty ideals of them, some venerable characteristic, right? We usually identify with some imperfection, some obscene aspect of them, some grotesque or unprofessional dimension, right? So the most obvious example of this for us is Trump. Everybody, liberals will sit around and get all mad and they'll go, how can people at all identify with this guy? How can he be who they base their group cohesion around? And what liberals miss is that it's precisely his obscenity, his vulgarity, that people identify with. It's him being rude to the liberals. It's him owning the libtards, right? It's that whole thing, making fun of the disabled journalists, right? That's what they identify with. And it's interesting to find that, right? Because when you look at group identity, group cohesion, we just spontaneously tend to look for some great aspect in the leader. And when we don't see that, we're sitting there going, it becomes this huge mystery. But the reason we identify with this obscene aspect, this rude aspect, this ugly, immoral, grotesque dimension is it signifies to us that this leader has the enjoyment that we all wish we had, right? This person can get away with this due to their symbolic power, right? Their potency, their effectivity in the social order. And so the very fact that they can get away with doing something that seems transgressive is precisely why we identify with them. And so via Freud, Lacan calls this the unary trait. If you want to put it up there, it's U-N...
This is a new one to me, actually.
Yeah.
So
U-N-A-R-Y trait. And I would put it between the imaginary and the symbolic. Because in some
hold on,
ways,
slow down. So I'm very slow. So unary, is there a Y at the end of that?
Yeah, it's U-N-A-R-Y trait. T-R-A-I-T.
And you would put it between the symbolic and the what?
I put it between the imaginary and the symbolic. And the reason is because, on the one hand, this trait is something I identify with. I either aspire to it or I like it. I feel like it somehow embodies me or it's speaking for me. But on the other hand, it also serves as a signifier that anchors you to other people, right? It's a signifier, a mark that you all share in common. And so it serves to have, it's almost, you can also think of it as a master signifier, I guess. It's that signifier that holds a group together, right? And so Trump supporters, I also think it's a mistake. Freud really puts the emphasis on it being singular, but I think there are clusters of unary traits. I think, for example, like with the Trump supporters, not all of them identify with him just because he's vulgar. A lot of them do. But other ones would say, oh, it's the Make America Great Again thing, which is to say, I identify with his sense of nostalgia, right? But there's a limited number of these unary traits, right? And, I mean, it would be interesting if you could say, all right, well, these are 3 unary traits that the various Trump supporters have. it would be more interesting to go, okay, can we find one behind these three? But this is one way of using semiotics or the analysis of language, right, to understand how certain signifiers hold various ideological spaces together, give them cohesion, right? This is one of the big problems with the left, right? We are all so fragmented on the left. We have Marxists, you have anarchists, you have social democrats, you have like liberal leftists. You have all these, and we can't get a signifier that unifies all of us, right? We spend so much time critiquing each other, we never can get on the same page. And it's not to say that there aren't substantial differences between these various isms, right? Of course there is, but it's almost like we're all dying for the left to finally unify right now. And the question of what kind of unary trait, what kind of master signifier could unify all of us is something that I think we should all be thinking about. And
by the way, in chat on YouTube, Illegal and Free showed up and said, wow, this is awesome. So first of all, Illegal and Free, it's good to see you again. Thank you. Also, Pills in the chat said this is amazing. Illegal and Free says, wow, I think you just summed up, this is speaking to you, the Dangerous maybe. Wow, I think you just summed up what my professor was trying to teach in political philosophy last semester, but we couldn't get there. Not surprising to me, by the way.
Thank you.
My experience of professors talking about these three registers is that they read Žižek's How to Read Lacan and nothing more, which is a great book, but
I love it.
You can't stop there.
But it's limited.
Yeah. It doesn't get into most of this stuff. I mean, not in this, not as clearly as you do. How about we put it that way?
Well, I appreciate it, but okay. So let's flesh out the symbolic a little more, because we've talked about it. Rules, norms, values, law, prohibitions. These all depend on language. They're all signifiers, right? I mean, we can't really make sense of the idea that you shouldn't kill somebody, right? Thou shalt not kill. How does that exist without language, right? It's determined. Language is required for that thought, for that idea. And so what we consider to be ideas, even thoughts, all of this depends on language. And so primarily the symbolic order, which he also calls the big other, is language. He also calls it the battery of signifiers, right? It's where all the signifiers are collected. It's where all the words. And so what Lacan brings to the table, you know this, Saussure. Lacan based his theory of language, or we should even say his theory of signs, his semiotics, on Saussure's theory of linguistics, his theory of sign semiology. And for Saussure, he believes that a sign, let's say the word cat, right? The word cat is comprised of two fundamental aspects. It depends on the literal mark, the literal word, what we call the word cat, right? This is the signifier, C-A-T, right? And for Saussure, the primary signifier isn't when we even write it, like Dave is doing right now. It's that acoustic, he calls it an acoustic image, but it's not really an image. When you're not talking, you can think to yourself the word cat, and you can hear yourself say it in your mind. You don't audibly say it, but you can still, in a sense, you can hear yourself talk to yourself. That's what he thinks a signifier primarily is this inaudible signifier that you can hear yourself say. But so a signifier is not reducible to literal marks, actual marks. But essentially, to simplify it, the signifier is the physical mark. So it's either the audible speaking of the word cat, or it's the writing of the word cat. That's the signifier. What the signified is the concept that's attached to it. So for Saussure, there's the signifier cat, and then there's the signified cat, and the signified cat is just merely the concept of cat, the image of catness, right? For Saussure, it's as if when
there's a little image, like a stick drawing, I guess you could say, of a cat, right? And that is the concept of cat for Saussure. Well, Lacan accepts a lot of this, and his semiotics, and Lacan, as far as I know, he didn't really call his theory of language or anything semiotics, but I'm using it as a generic term here for his theory of signs. What Lacan introduces is the primacy of the signifier. Saussure thought there was a one-to-one correlation between a signifier and a signified, and that one-to-one correlation together formed a sign. A sign is a signifier and a signified. But what Lacan showed, and this comes out of his work in the clinic, this comes from his work dealing with patients every day, with them free associating, or at least attempting to free associate while doing psychoanalysis. And so he develops what he calls the primacy of the signifier. For Saussure, he feels like there's a certain, not equality, but the signifier and the signified are just as important for the production of meaning, for our ability to speak. Whereas for Lacan, he puts the emphasis on the signifier. And the reason is because he doesn't believe signifiers in and of themselves have one corresponding idea. And he feels like this comes out of Saussure, and this is very Derridian, right? Derrida was thinking along these same lines, which is to say, okay, Saussure says signs don't mean anything on their own. They only mean something based on their position in language.
That's why I wrote here that for Saussure, signs are contextually determined, right?
Exactly, but the best way to put it is they're differential. It's precisely their differences between. It's the difference between the word cat, tree, dog, human, right? It's a system of differences, and the identity of the word cat actually depends on its linguistic and conceptual differences between itself and all the other words in language. And so, Heidegger, right? You go back to Heidegger and Being and Time. Heidegger says there is no such thing as an equipment, as a tool, right? To have a hammer, yeah, you can view it as some pure chunk of matter, but the hammer in its full hammerness requires boards and nails. The hammer depends on other pieces of equipment for it to be the piece of equipment that it is. Well, Saussure has a very similar theory when it comes to signs. Signs only mean something based on their relation or their difference to other signs.
Right.
And so both Lacan and Derrida say, yeah, that's right, but Saussure failed to take this to its logical conclusion, which is to say each sign doesn't have some pure isolatable concept attached to it. It's other signifiers being connected to other signifiers that produce signification. That's where conceptual meaning comes into play. It's how you arrange signifiers among themselves. So I'll give you basic examples, right? I put together a little list. And the list is comprised of a series of statements. I love this, I love that. Now think of how different you register what the I means. You'll go through this list and you're going to go, well, the I takes on drastically different meanings based on how it's connected to other signifiers. So the first one, right? I love Christianity. Now the I that says that, you get a certain concept of what's behind that, right? So I love Christianity. But imagine somebody saying, I love Hitler. Now imagine somebody saying, I love football. Or somebody saying, I love Tumblr. Or somebody saying, I love pornography. Or somebody saying, I love Lacanian psychoanalysis. You can try to act like...
Are you just looking at things in your room and saying that you love them?
Oh, there it is. You caught me. But no, you see that the I in each case, you get a drastically different concept of the subject in question based on the signifier that follows it, right?
Right.
And so, and here's the thing, even if somebody was to say, well, you're talking about the particularity of the I, what about I-ness in general? Even then, you still have to go to other signifiers to even begin to make sense of what I means. And so Lacan, this is one of his famous ideas. In analysis, the signifier is what truly matters. And think about it, when you have a parapraxis, right? When you have a slip of the
What's
tongue.
analysis? I used to not know this. Yeah. What is analysis?
Well, it's psychoanalysis.
So therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
You know, in this case, it's going in and free associating and the analyst trying to get the analysand, or the patient, but Lacan calls the patient the analysand, trying to get the analysand to stay focused on those areas of their speech that have certain centers of gravity. Okay, so if you're an analyst, you want to pay attention. Some people will always be repeating something. They'll always have to talk about this person, no matter where they start off in analysis. No matter where they start talking, it's like all roads lead back to their uncle, or all roads lead back to their coworker. Well, the very fact that it keeps getting repeated, that indicates to the analyst that something's going on there that needs to be explored. And the way you explore it in analysis is to have the analysand free associate. Keep talking about it, fleshing it out, keep saying whatever comes to mind about this, right? And a lot of people, it's like they always will, it's like a center of gravity. They're always pulled towards that, but the second you tell them to keep talking about it, and like then they want to not talk about it. But then the other big indication is when, say somebody's been in analysis for 6 months, and then they finally mention this uncle or this aunt or this friend that they had growing up who was a major person in their life. Of course, it could be their mom, their dad, their grandmother. But if somebody totally avoids discussing a certain topic that had a big impact on their life history, that's another indicator you want to talk. You want them to free associate on that. So it's the things that they always repeat, they always go back to, and the things that they avoid, like the plague. Yeah, that's a poor choice of words considering what's going on. But the things that they constantly go out of their way to avoid talking about, or the things that they can't help repeating, those indicate that there's some sort of unconscious trauma, some unresolved issue there. And that's what analysis is about, is working through these kind of things. And it depends on free association. And so,
and I would just like, and this is related to the whole Oedipus thing we're going to get into. Just this is the analyst versus the analysand. Analysand, the person laying on the couch or whatever, they're the free associating person, and the analyst is the person who sits there. Now in American ego psychology, it's like, oh, how do you feel about that? And oh, you know, what about you do this and what about that? And it's more of like a
buddy.
They're your buddy. And for Lacan, it's like, you're not going to fucking grow up talking to a person who's doing that. It's infantilizing, and not in an explicit way, because they can be a very mature, very sophisticated psychologist. You know, they've done a lot of schooling to get to where they are, and you've got a healthy therapist patient relationship here. But from the standpoint of this kind of an analysis, because of all of this stuff having to do with desire, like, we put that person in the power position. We put stuff on them. Like, we want their affirmation. We want their recognition. We think that they have answers to our problems. And a big part of the analyst's job is not giving you what you want, and not feeding. It's like, it's actually one of the most excruciatingly awkward things a lot of the time, because they restrain themselves, and they're very well practiced in not just kind of like the way that I talk with, like when you're talking and I'm sitting here nodding my head or whatever, like, I do that in conversations because it's, no, you're not going to get that from an analyst. They're like, because to win at analysis, like a big part of it is like, well, we can get into that later, but basically they have to foil your desire.
Well, exactly. Well, here's the thing, right? If you stay locked, the first thing, there's kind of a trajectory. Bruce Fink, in his great book on how Lacanian psychoanalysis or Lacanian theory functions in the clinical setting, Bruce Fink's book is amazing. We'll talk about recommendations as we approach time to wrap it up. But Bruce Fink says, look, at first, analysis has to get past the imaginary. Essentially, the imaginary is bullshit. You are not these images. This is not the truth of your subjectivity. This is what you think you are. This is what you are convinced that you are. But you are not images that you identify with. Those are not you. And so the thing is, if you lock into the analyst as an alter ego, the whole interaction is going to be based on, you like this, I like that, you think this, I think that. And it all becomes this tug of war. Because even though we didn't go into it, part of the imaginary order is aggressivity, right? You're always, we've talked about this before, right, when we talk about the imaginary, where when it's ego to ego, at first, if you see somebody and they're too much like you immediately hate them. Because you're sitting there going, how dare you? You're taking my identity from me. You pose a threat to my identity, right? You see this in every area of life. And then if they both come to give each other mutual recognition, then they become like best friends because they validate each other, right? This is the kind of shit that's going on in the imaginary register, and you have to totally get past this in order for the real work of analysis to begin. Which, you know, there's substantial work to be done in the symbolic, which has to do with some people suffer because of the norms they feel like they have to live in accordance with, the values that have been imposed on them that they feel like they can't live up to, right? They like part of analysis for some people is breaking down the norms that they feel like they have to be a subject to, right? Getting free from these norms, these values that stifle desire, that keep you from being who you feel like you need to be, right? But the real work of analysis is even beyond the symbolic, which has to do with the real. And in this context, it means all of those repressed traumas, all of that unconscious baggage, all of those unconscious unresolved issues that you haven't worked through that continue to affect you and shape your life in negative ways, right? So, I mean, a basic example would be, imagine somebody who in their romantic life, they always date the same kind of person, and yet this type, you know, is highly problematic, leads them to live a life of dysfunction. And so there's unconscious mechanisms at work that causes a person to desire this type that actually prevents their pleasure, prevents them from living a fulfilling life. And those kind of dynamics are in the real, right? They're unconscious. They're not part of our conscious or even pre-conscious reality. And though that's where like the real work of analysis has to go. And so that is where analysis starts focusing on your unconscious desire, your drives, your fundamental fantasies, that sort of thing. And those are all for us. Those are all out of conscious, pre-conscious awareness. And so the real aspect of analysis, the main meat of the work, is to be done on the real. But it's like it's almost like a dialectic. You start with the imaginary, and of course, you know, Lacanian analysts don't want to talk. They talk as little as they possibly can, right? They want you, the patient, the analysand, to free associate as much as you can. Why? Because they don't have the key to your unconscious. You have it. The knowledge to what's going on with you is in you, not in the analyst. The analyst just is there to serve a pure function to facilitate you coming to this awareness for yourself. But they don't have the knowledge, you do. And yet,
sort of sounding board.
Yeah, we've talked about it before. Like, this is where you have to go into analysis duped. You have to go in believing that the analyst is the big other, in this sense, the one who knows, the one who has all the answers, in order to get anything out of it. And even though the analyst isn't the big other, the analyst doesn't have all the knowledge. It doesn't have any knowledge of your unconscious to begin with. And so only the duped, only those who go in expecting something from the analyst that the analyst doesn't have can actually achieve something in analysis. And so this is where, but this essentially analysis will eventually get to the real. It'll get to all the repressed baggage that we're walking around with that determine our life, determine our romantic endeavors, determine our career aspirations, all of this kind of stuff. And all of those things that we do that constantly repeat our suffering, that keep us suffering, that, you know, generate psychical issues, all this kind of stuff, those are all situated in the real. And so this is a good way to pivot towards the real, and some other stuff that's in it. So let me see.
So I'm going to go ahead and erase the stuff we have on the right-hand side of this board. Essentialism, libidinal economy, subjectivity, ideology. That was at the beginning for the folks just joining us now. Welcome. Twitch and YouTube. I'm multi-streaming. Fuck affiliate status. I don't care about Twitch anymore. And I am, because affiliate rips you off. You don't get paid even half of what people donate to you. And it's not all about money, folks. I spent 2 weeks trying to get my normie socialism emote approved by Twitch, and then they denied it. And I was like, you know, I know for a fact that if I worked with Whiteleaf, I could have my own site, and then I could have my own emotes there. So we can have any fucking emotes we want. We can have dicks. We can have, which we will. I don't think we do yet. In fact, chat, do we have dicks? Get dicks on screen if we have that awesome emote, the one where it's rainbow and it just says dicks. Anyway, well, we can have anything we want. We can have political ones. I'm going to have an entire tier that if you subscribe to my website, it unlocks an entire tier of philosophers' faces. I'll have another one for contemporary politics, whatever. Anyway, so get over to that. That's where if you're like, why am I typing and nothing's coming up on screen? That's why. You got to go to www.theoryplebe.com/live. And there we go. I am object. You nailed it. Nailed it. There it says dicks. Nice. All right. So, and you can multiply it. It's times. That's cool. Okay. So anyway.
Okay. There's something essential to say about the symbolic before we move on.
Okay, good.
Okay. So here's a key thing. So if Lacan, if you want to say, Lacan, we talk about Heidegger's the thinker of being, right? Merleau-Ponty's the thinker of perception. Certain Lacanians will probably disagree with me on this, but I think it's fair to say that Lacan is the thinker of lack. Because all of these things, whether we talk about the phallus, objet petit a, jouissance, das Ding, they're all different types of lacks, right? And they all have different statuses, but Lacan is fundamentally concerned with lack. And he doesn't think lack truly enters into the human equation until the signifier, right? And by the signifier, he uses this like how the French use the term the other. It means the others. It means, the signifier means signifiers. It means language. Yeah, sometimes, of course, he's talking about a particular signifier, but it's the signifier can usually be read as language, the symbolic order, etc. So here's the thing. The world doesn't lack anything in and of itself. It's only language that produces lack. Things are only missing or absent because we have used a language system to determine that they belong in a certain place. Now, Lacan's example is the Dewey Decimal System that they used in libraries. So say you walk in and you want to read Sartre's Being and Nothingness, and you go over to the philosophy section, you look to the shelf with the S's, and you notice that where being and nothingness should be, it's gone, right? And you say, oh, it's lacking, it's missing, it's not there, it's absent. It's only the signifier, it's only language that produces this absence, right? Absence depends on integration into language. And this is fundamental, right? This is going to shape our very subjectivity because it's with us that things lack. Think about it. To be a desiring subject, to say I desire, means to lack something. Whatever it is that you desire, you lack. You wouldn't desire it if you had it. And so when Lacan talks about the barred subject or the divided subject or the subject of desire, or he's talking about a person with a lack, somebody who's lacking something. And so lack is this fundamental concept in Lacanian psychoanalysis, and we're going to see that it takes on a number of different shapes and forms. And so, but it's important to realize that lack is, somebody just mentioned in the chat needs. Yeah, I I would like to go. That would take us too far off course, but Lacan does focus on needs, and maybe we'll circle back around to needs a little bit. But there's this dialectic in Lacan that goes from needs to demands to desire, and Lacan was really big on this dialectic in the earlier period of his work.
It's a big part of the mirror phase, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, well, yeah. Here's the thing: to talk about needs, we're going to have to talk about drives and how, what that, and then we get into demand. It's a whole other thing. So maybe we'll come back to that if we have a chance. But
for now, though, it's needs. It's the dialectic between what three things, though?
It goes from needs to demand to desire. It's considered like this Lacanian dialectic. You move from one to the other.
Okay.
Yeah, if we have a chance, that creepy fellow, we'll come back to that.
Oh my God, I never know how to handle that creepy fellow's comments because of his name or their name, because think about it, it's like anything you say is fine, but then as soon as your name is that creepy fella, everything is put in a different light altogether. So I'm like, all right. But welcome. It's good to have you in chat. So anyway, we'll get into that. We'll get into it. But I had written, I just erased it to write the other thing, and I made space on this other side here for lack. But when you're thinking of lack, I would point back at this trophy, right? Your ideal ego is to be that kiddo who gets the thing. You know the thing. Once you get it, then you gain the respect or recognition from a community or a person that you aspire to be elevated in. And the fact that you lack that thing that you need is probably why you're such an awkward fucking teenager, huh? It's like, it's a big part of it. It's like you've got ideas that there are things that you need before you can even respect yourself. So,
well, and this is, I mean, we'll come back to this because we need to get into fantasy and all this other stuff to start talking about it. But our lack, I mean, this is what's so fundamental to the kid, and this is a dynamic that we take with us our whole life. Is, I mean, this is where you can really affect people, right? If you say the wrong thing to them, if you point out something they lack, and that's precisely what they're trying to cover over, this is like psychic damage to them, right? And
huge problem with toxically masculine dudes, especially. Right?
Yeah, exactly. This is where Lacan is very helpful when it comes to this problem, because the whole point is, the toxic masculine kind of mindset is I have to be the subject that lacks nothing. Well, that is as imaginary as it gets. We all lack. I mean, you're not a human being unless you lack, and lack in this fundamental sense, and then of course this is going to carry out to particular lacks. But anyway, okay, so we've talked about the imaginary, we've talked about the symbolic, and there's stuff that I could add on, but let's get to the real.
Let's get to the real. Let's get down into the real nitty gritty shit. Yeah, thank you, by the way, for that follow. Also, by the way, you people over on YouTube, I know you're all just waiting. Like you don't want to click the like button because this could go off the rails and then you might hate it. And then you'd have to do all the work of retracting that like. But if you like it, more people will see it. You know, it's for the algorithm and all that. So, but also obviously I'm also trying to steal people from that platform over to my personal site. But okay, now we're shifting gears to the real. And once again, we've got Bob from Twin Peaks. We've got Das Ding. We've got repressed desire, trauma, which, by the way, that's what really Bob is all about, right? A repressed trauma, probably. But yeah. Anyway, then we got COVID-19, whatever, because we're going about society's working. Everything makes sense, reality. And then some Das Ding comes out of nowhere, fucks it all up.
Yeah. And so, no, I mean, so there's, Das Ding, so, okay. I'm torn on whether or not I even want to go into Das Ding because I feel like it will take us too far off track. And
do you see how frustrating it is to talk to a Lacanian? Like, let's quick aside. This is why Lacanians won't talk, like, because they've been trying to read Lacan all this time. By the way, someone in the chat had been like, "Will you help me read Ecri. A lot of people do try to read Ecri thinking that's the one. By the way, for the folks who saw it, it looks like it's spelled Ecritz. It's Ecri. But anyway, point being, that's not a readable text, and that's not where to go for it. You want to read the seminars. But even then, most people haven't read more than a few of the seminars, much less the essential ones. And so usually it's people read some Žižek talking about Lacan. And but the people who, I mean, I've heard Mikey express, or Michael express a lot of frustration on this note. It's just like, it's really hard to find people who are willing to speak about these concepts, because fantasy is not the imaginary. Fantasy is not desire. Needs are not demands. Needs are not enjoyment. Enjoyment is not desire. All of these things have different meanings. They work in different registers. Am I getting followed, rated, hosted? I don't know what that alert was for, but thank you. So anyway, it's complicated.
So briefly, right? Let's give a definition of the real to start off with. The real is all of those dynamics, aspects, things that are repressed, that are in the unconscious, that don't seem to have any bearing, any reality whatsoever. We don't notice them, we're not aware of them in our everyday conscious reality, and yet they're there, and they are fundamentally structuring our reality more than any of the shit that we're conscious of. And there's moments when this stuff breaks through, right? That it ceases to be repressed, it ceases to be unconscious, and it explodes into conscious reality, and it has a way of exploding it or shattering it. And this works on the individual level, which is if you suffer a horrific trauma, right, and it gets repressed, it has a way of constantly eating at you, constantly returning in various forms, and it's going to continue to return in various forms until it's dealt with, right, until it's worked through. And at the social level, right, I use the example of coronavirus. I mean, 2 months ago, we thought, oh, it's just some virus, not that big of a deal. And then, of course, look what it does to our conscious social reality. Our whole world's been turned upside down by this thing that just explodes from out of nowhere and shatters the coordinates of our social reality. And so the real is basically, you can just think of it, it's all the stuff that's in our blind spot. It's the aspects of ourselves that we're not aware of. It's the desires that we have we're not aware of. It's all of those, nature in a sense has this real dimension, right? We think we've mastered nature because of science and technology, but we haven't. Nature can throw us a curveball at any second. And all of these aspects, these unconcealed aspects of nature or of ourselves that we're not aware of, they all count as the real. And so the reason like I think he talked about it and called it the real, and a lot of the times it was capitalized, and the reason he contrasts this with reality is the real is the really real. It's what really is structuring our world and ourselves. And yet it seems as if it has no reality at all when viewed from the perspective of our waking conscious reality. And so there's all kinds of various elements of the real. One, the most famous is objet petit a. And Dave, if you should probably if you haven't already, write that on the board. I think you did. Okay. It's a French term, and if you translate, it doesn't work in translation. And if you do it literally, it's object small o, which obviously means next to nothing, right? The much more helpful term for this is the object cause of desire. But here's the problem. And this is one of the big obstacles to get past when you get into reading Lacan, the way Lacanians use the word object is incredibly confusing. At least us Americans, us in the English-speaking world, when we think objects, we think about physical things that take up space, right? We think about things that can be weighed on a scale when we use the word object. And that's not what that's not how Lacanians use this term.
Right. There's an object of a sentence.
Right, exactly.
Right. It's probably more like that kind of an object, right?
Well, like phantasmatic objects, right? But the thing is, when we talk about objet petit a in its purest form, it's no thing. It's just an empty, it's just a lack. It's just this X that we posit that, I mean, it doesn't take up any space. You can't weigh it. Now, it's like this thing, this factor, this cause of desire, we end up attaching it or associating it with actual things, right? But it's not these things themselves. And in fact, let's put it like this. This is always helpful. If there were no human beings, there would be no objets petit a. There would be no causes of desire. And so their reality depends on us, right? But in a weird twist, our reality as desiring subjects depend on them. And, you know, there's so much to say about objet petit a. And this is, I wrote a whole blog post devoted to this because it's
a long one.
Long and nuanced concept, and it does so much.
Talk about its critical reception for a quick sec. I mean, you kind of have, I mean, we didn't talk about it earlier, you know.
Well, I think the best way to approach it is to say, okay, look, there's objects we desire. There's things that we sit around and think, oh, if I could just be married to a person like this, or if I just had a house that with certain things in it, right? Or if I had that car, or if I had that job, right? There's things that we are aware that we desire, or the objects of desire. And the objects of desire we're aware of at a conscious level, or at least a pre-conscious level. There's no surprise. Like, yes, I think about that thing, I desire that thing, I'm pursuing that thing, I want that thing. But the unconscious aspect of desire is objet petit a, which is the cause of desire. It's that which causes you to desire the object of your desire, right? And this is the much more interesting concept for Lacan. Like, okay, we have all kinds of objects we desire, but what is it about them? What causes us to desire those objects? And this cause is always out of sight. We're not aware of this cause of desire. And the way I liken it, what I liken it to in the blog post is the relationship between a ballerina on stage dancing and the spotlight that makes the ballerina visible. When you're at a dance recital and you're seeing a ballerina perform, your attention is focused on the ballerina. You're not aware of the spotlight itself, and yet the spotlight is what's making this performance possible. It's what's lighting up the ballerina and setting the ambiance, right? There's such a difference between you know, a performance that's spotlit opposed to one that's not. And so in this case, the objet petit a would be or the cause would be the spotlight, and the object of desire would be the dancer, right? And so when you're walking around, think about all the stuff you see on a daily basis. Most of it you don't desire. Something's causing you to desire the things that you desire. And that is what objet petit a is. And again, this concept, you know, it just keeps blossoming out. It gets bigger and bigger and richer. But simply put, here's what it is. It's a virtual object, and I use virtual in the way that Deleuze uses it, which is to say, it's something that we posit to be real, that's out there, and yet it's not an actual physical thing. And so what happens is this. We were going to talk about Oedipus complex, but Lacan ends up later, he talks less about Oedipus complex, and he comes up with this other theory of how we become socialized, right? And instead of talking about the mother and the father and all that, he ends up talking about S1 and S2 and objet petit a. But to take all the jargon out of it, right, here's what happens. At some point when you're a kid, some external authority is going to step in and say, you cannot live an existence of immediate gratification. You can't just do whatever you want whenever you want and experience the type of bodily sensations you want whenever you want. There has to be limits put on your body, put on your physical reality, in order for you to become socialized, to take on the norms of your society, right? And this, I mean, if we think about it in terms of Lacan's concept of the Oedipus complex, it has to do with you have to separate from your mother's body, right? And by mother, again, I mean primary caregiver. The mother could be a biological man. But whoever your primary caregiver is, the kid has been attached to this person since day one. A human child requires constant care and attention. And at some point, you know, the immediate gratification the child gets from the other has to be broken. And this is what Lacan at one point calls symbolic castration. And it's not castration in the Freudian sense of, oh, if I don't do what my dad is demanding of me, he's going to cut my penis off. It's not that at all. Symbolic castration, what's castrated is just you living in a state of immediate gratification. Now you have to live according to certain guidelines, principles, rules, i.e. you have to live in accordance with the law. And so, in a weird sense, to enter into the symbolic order, to become socialized, you have to give up this immediate gratification. And yet it's not really an immediate gratification isn't an object. It's not some literal thing you give up. But the very fact that law or the big other or the symbolic order demands this of you, you're sacrificing something. And after you make this sacrifice, this becomes a structure. That thing that you gave up, that little, oh, I had to sacrifice it to become a social subject, that what falls out, as Lacan puts it, is objet petit a. And in this sense, this quote object, that which isn't really an object, but it functions like an object. You think it's this missing piece of yourself that if only I could get this thing back that I had to sacrifice, I would have full ontological completeness. I would be whole. And the point is, the thing that you sacrificed, the thing you gave up, isn't a thing at all. It's a weird effect of language or law, living in accordance with certain principles, certain norms. And so it's as if you gave up, and here's the term I'm going to add on here. It's as if you gave up this primordial jouissance. And jouissance is this French term, and I prefer to leave it untranslated, although a lot of Lacanians, Žižek included, translate it as enjoyment. I don't like enjoyment because I think for us in the English-speaking world, enjoyment carries too many, I guess you would call them soft enjoyment's light entertainment or fun or whatever. And jouissance carries this much more intense, extreme, even traumatic sense. And so retroactively, once we're in language, once we've started to become socialized, it's as if we retroactively say, oh, there was this immense, intense enjoyment we had before we had to start playing by the rules, and I had to sacrifice this enjoyment. But in reality,
like shitting whenever you want.
Exactly. You shit whenever you want.
That's a big deal for a fucking baby. So in terms of traumas, it's like first you're torn out of the womb where things were whole and you didn't have a sense of self beyond like your heart, whatever sounds. And then you're torn from the wholeness and the wonder of all that into this fucking stinking reality where at least you can shit when you want to. And then all of a sudden you're getting in trouble when you're doing that. And all the people in your life are manipulating you constantly manipulating you to get you to stop shitting, to get you to stop pissing, to get you to stop screaming, and
or breastfeeding.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's the thing for Lacan, with Freud, there are these primary objects the kid is focused on: the breast, the gaze of the other, the look of the mother, right, or the primary caregiver. Because you could say attention, right, is this fundamental thing. There's been these studies where these horrible situations where there's been kids in orphanages that they never get any attention, they never get hugged, or they never get any recognition from the other, and these kids will die in infancy, not due to a lack of food or nourishment, but from a lack of attention. And so the attention of the primary caregiver is fundamental to the development of an infant. And voice is another one, right? Voice is, somebody said Czech Republic. Yeah, that's what I have in mind. So the primary object.
Mikey, what are you? Sorry, wait, you're in the wrong chat.
I'm looking at I am. I'm looking at YouTube.
I mean, that's fine. Hi, Phaedrus. It's good to see you there, the creepy fellow. It's like the creepy fellow is the only one really keeping that chat alive, but it looks like Phaedrus is also in there.
There's these primary objects that the kid, their early childhood, early infancy is based around, which is the breast, which it has a relation to the mouth of the infant. The child's eyes, right? They're focused on the gaze of the primary caregiver. The ears are fixated on the voice of the primary caregiver. And then feces, as you were saying, it's this fundamental object at play, that the child's sense of recognition and dignity, I shit when I'm supposed to, that makes the other happy and makes me proud. And so there's this whole symbolic aspect to shitting when it's appropriate, right? Lacan famously said, human beings are the ones for whom shitting becomes a problem, right? Like he wants to say that's how we define the human essence is, unlike all other species, shitting is a problem for us. And so anyway, to go back around, so the kid, the kid who's gone through what we'll talk about the Oedipus complex, but we could also just call it socialization. The kid retroactively posits, oh, there was this immense enjoyment I had that I had to sacrifice to become socialized. And so it's like we reify this and turn it into this thing that we lost, this missing part of ourselves, and that is objet petit a. And so, you get these funny moments from cinema, right? Jerry Maguire, you complete me. Renee Zellweger's character, you could say in a Lacanian perspective, is as if she carries the objet petit a. She carries the cause of desire, right? It's not an object of desire. It's the very thing that makes you desire in the first place. Well, you only desire, as a kid, you only desire precisely because you lack jouissance, because you lack satisfaction. It's been evacuated from your reality. Now everything's not immediate gratification. And we reify this loss, and it becomes this thing that it's like the proverbial donkey's carrot, right? It's the thing that keeps us desiring. We're constantly chasing it, and we think this thing's going to satisfy me. This thing's going to give me the sense of completion I've never had but always yearned for. And you go from object to object to object, but you never actually get the objet petit a because it's an impossible object. You can't ever get it because it's not an actual thing. It's, for lack of a better term, it's a structure of the psyche. It's the effect of, quote, the signifier. This is something that happens to us given, the kind of reality we have in infancy, and what happens when language and norms and law become part of our reality. And so what happens is that there's this remainder, right? It's almost as if it's like this concentrated nugget of jouissance, of this intense enjoyment, and we think if we ever get this thing that we're going to have an ontological wholeness that we always are chasing, and yet it's impossible, right? This is the whole thing. Like, you are what defines your ontology is you are precisely the lack of this object. You are your pursuit of it. That's what the Lacanian subject is the pursuit of this lost object. And
now, does he trans-historicize this, or is this specific to capitalism for him?
No, I don't. I mean, look, it's not polite. That's interesting, and there is a book, I know you know of it, called The Capitalist Unconscious.
Yeah. Is that McGowan?
No, it's I'm going to butcher the name. It looks like Samo Tomczyk.
Right. I have both of those books because there's also Capitalism and Desire, which is a Lacanian thing by McGowan. But anyway,
yeah.
So yeah, but this ties right into what I Am Object was even, or no wait, who was this saying earlier? Like, but when Timenergy and libidinal economy and how capitalism subjectivizes us, right? And like, so this is why it's essential for consumerism, basically, folks. Because we're all on this like journey to get the thing, and every fucking capitalist wants to tell you, haha, I got you. It's this job. It's this career. Yeah.
This is part of what my book, I mean, this is a central focus of trying to give my interpretation of how this stuff works. But here's what Lacan would say as far as the historical aspect, like you're talking about. You'd say, look, all I'm talking about, like, I'm not analyzing people in, quote, you know, tribal societies or feudal societies, right? I'm analyzing modern subjects who are the products of capitalist society. And he could very well say that, hey, libidinal economies work differently in societies that had fundamentally different structures. I don't think, you got to realize, and this is of fundamental importance when approaching Lacan's work. He says it time and time again. In every seminar, at one point, he'll say something along these lines, which is, hey, I'm not a theorist. I'm not doing this for like a Marxist political economy or critique of ideology. I'm not doing this for the sake of philosophy. My seminar is the fundamental purpose it serves is to train young analysts to become analysts, to train them for the work of psychoanalysis. And so a lot of us who are interested in philosophy will approach Lacan's work like we're getting ready to read Heidegger or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche, and we're not, because he has a fundamentally different purpose in holding these seminars. He wants to train analysts to be good analysts, to be able to do the work of helping people deal with their traumas, their hang-ups, their fixations. And so that's one of the tricks that we end up having as people who come from philosophy, is we think this guy's going to be a philosopher and that his goal is to like make philosophical arguments that establish philosophical truth. No, that's not what he's doing. He's trying to say, this is what you're going to deal with in the clinical setting, and here are conceptual tools that help you manage, interpret, and understand what you're dealing with. And so we always have to keep that in mind when approaching Lacan, is he's not speaking from, he would call it the subject of enunciation, right? He makes a distinction between subject of enunciation and the subject of the enunciated, or the subject of the statement, which is to say, there's what you say about yourself when you speak, but then there's also the position from which you speak it, right? And we think that Lacan is speaking from the position of a philosopher, and he's not. He's speaking from the position of a clinician, somebody who every day is helping people work through their traumas and their unconscious dynamics. So, you know, it's wrong to just go to him like he's engaged in philosophy, right, even though, you know, he uses so many philosophical ideas.
He read a lot of our favorites, but yeah, it's not his primary thing. I want to just quick circle back to one of the questions that's in our Discord channel for this topic. For the folks just joining the Discord, we have a category called guest lectures, and we're doing a course that is every Saturday at 2 p.m. Hawaiian time. There's a few other times that I should write up on the board before I forget, but we're doing a philosophy of statistics and also just some basic statistics. And you can go find the videos for all of that in there. But then we also have this is there as well, just under the dangerous maybe in guest lectures. And so there you will find where if your question did not get seen or heard or responded to, you could always bring it up there. But Brazilian did put a couple there from before just in case. One of those questions was, and by the way, the command, if you're on Twitch or YouTube, ! Discord will bring up the link so you can join. All right. But one of the things that they were asking was, what about in societies that are less consumeristic? What about, is this helpful in societies that are less consumeristic, or in societies that like aren't fully capitalist or haven't become capitalist yet. Would this be true of indigenous societies? Or and I would just say really quick, in Debt, the first 5,000 years by David Graeber, a big part of, he goes into it, is that a part of colonialism and getting people hooked into these alienated institutions that are so parasitic on us is getting people to learn to desire as consumerists. And he uses the Malagasy as one of his examples, because he's done field research as an anthropologist, and he goes to Madagascar as one of his destinations. He was there for a while, and the whole process of imperialism there, I think it was French. It involved them like really trying to get people hooked in to, oh, you want this thing from abroad, because if you're not hooked into that global network of commodities, like everyone was already self-reliant. We don't need your money. We've already got our shit. Like what is this? And it was a process. And colonialism in general, I think, works this way. But he explicitly talks about it in Debt, the first 5,000 years. So.
What I'll say, and again, I could be completely wrong about this, but this is just my spontaneous response, is I think whether we're talking about tribal societies, or we're talking about feudal society, or capitalist society, or socialist society, right? Yeah, USSR. What is true is, don't the babies all start off the same way, right? They all, in all these societies, infants require immense care, attention, nourishment, and there's some primary caregiver. Now, maybe on a tribal society, you're not fixated on the baby's not just, it's one person, but it would be, a group of people who take care of the child. But nonetheless, at some point, every human infant is faced with this. It's a forced choice, really. You have to give up this, for lack of a better term, mindset of immediate gratification, of only being concerned with the immediacy of your pleasure or desire, your jouissance, or it's not even desire, because you're really not lacking. Lack really enters in when prohibition kicks in. And so regardless of the various types of societies, it seems to me that there's still a fundamental mechanism at play for all human infants, that if you are going to live, because all of them, whether, I know that the tribal society, feudal society, capitalist society, of course, they're radically different symbolic orders, but they are all symbolic orders. And those
are symbolic orders that for you to get inducted into them properly probably involve, actual markings on your body being going, it's burned into your skin, it's scarification, it's the rite of passage where you're kicked out for a while or whatever, like there's all these things that go into it. And we as continental philosophers, what's closest is going to be Foucault's analysis of society and discipline and punishment, where it's like it's these deeply visceral, traumatic spectacles that are used to give people this strong sense of prohibition, right?
And Deleuze and Guattari are fantastic on this kind of thing too, in Anti-Oedipus. And I know Lacan and Žižek are always, they're always presented as being at war with Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, and there are certainly incompatibilities there. But I think D&G do a really awesome job of exploring the semiotic and libidinal dynamics of these various types of social orders. And so they do a really good job of that there. But yeah, I think it just boils down to the fact that at some point a kid has to say, okay, I'm going to give up what I take to be, this immediate gratification. I'm going to have to live in conformity with the structure of the symbolic order that's imposing these prohibitions on me. And so whether you're a tribal subject or a feudal subject or a capitalist subject, you as a human being have to basically go, hey, I'm going to be compliant with the demands, with the laws, the prohibitions you're placing on me, and I'm going to live more or less in accordance with them. And in that sense, you can say there is a sacrifice that there's something that every baby has to give up to be integrated into any symbolic order at all.
Right.
Again, I would have to rethink it with much more detail and nuance, but that's just my initial response. Is it seems like every human infant has to go through a similar process that it's like they all share a common structure, even though those symbolic orders differ greatly.
Right. So the sense that the people in your immediate vicinity as a child, that they answer to outside forces, still going to be there because nature has a bigger presence to you, and people having to go rough it and survive. If you're in a super primordial state, which is, but if you're this is muddy territory because a lot of people don't like to talk about human universals after deconstruction, but it's one of our favorite things about theories of subjectivity, because it's like, okay, yeah, thinking about humans as universals, transparent universals that would be able to speak for everyone and everything in all time is super problematic in a lot of ways. It's the imperial gaze, but once you get through that process of deconstruction and realizing how totalizing all of that can be, there's still like, okay, beyond the fact that we all breathe and need sleep and water, a roof over our head, or some kind of a shelter from nature, there are other things that we all experience, right? Now, we might experience time differently depending on our culture. We might experience the way we lack, right? So the ways we lack or the ways we desire, the objects of those desires, those things are all exchangeable. But overall, we definitely go through a mirror phase. Everyone goes through a fucking mirror phase, or you don't, or you remain like a feral child, right? You Mowgli.
Yeah, you have to get a sense of self. I mean, here's the thing: if we talk about these various symbolic orders, right? What's the one fundamental prohibition they all have in common? It's the incest taboo. This is what psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan talk about this all the time. And the way Lacan interprets it is, at some point, you have to give up the immediate gratification you experience in relation to the primary caregiver's body. You have to give that up. And you can't go back to that. That's what the incest taboo. And yes, traditionally, the primary caregiver is your biological mother, right? That's true. But Lacan is not going to limit it to that. He's going to give it this broader function where it could be your dad. It could be your grandparent. It could be your uncle, right? It could be adopted parents. So the point, though, is at some point you have to give up the immediate gratification you experience in relation to the body of the primary caregiver. And that is what the incest taboo is fundamentally about. You have to give that up.
Yeah, and the incest taboo, everyone loved it because it's a universal. Because it's like in every society, you might be able to marry your cousin in some societies, but probably not. And then there's probably all sorts of ways that from society to society this is handled. And second cousins are okay, third cousins are okay. The bigger the society, the more points of removal are codified into the rules that people live by. And so yeah.
And so I mean the sociologist / anthropologist that Lacan is drawing on is, of course, Claude Lévi-Strauss and his book, Elementary Structures of Kinship. And that's, Lévi-Strauss is talking about the incest taboo and the function it served and so on and so forth. And Lacan is taking that and showing how it functions in our libidinal economies. And yeah, so I mean, I guess, because we've been at this about 3 hours. We kind of reached a point where we can start to wrap it up.
Yeah.
And we've talked about the 3 registers, which is fundamental. Like, that's the key thing you have to discuss, for an introduction to Lacan. Maybe we'll come back in a week, and because I have so many more notes and so many more concepts that I wanted to get to, but
yeah, I want you to be able to do needs, desire, demands, and then the big one, which is drives.
Oh, I mean, look, so here's, I have desire versus drive. I have gaze. I have anxiety. I have fundamental fantasy. I have sexuation, the ethics of psychoanalysis. God is unconscious. All human sexuality is unnatural. I was going to talk about Žižek on racism. I was going to talk about D&G's critique of Lacan, or at least their critique of psychoanalysis. There's so much I wanted to get to, but again, you know, these concepts, they're so rich and they're so complicated that, you know, we can't rush it. Otherwise, it won't make any sense whatsoever. So I think it's good just to leave off, you know, we
have a lot here. Yeah.
Yeah.
We do. Folks, just so you know, we're not going to close it out automatically. We're going to go for another half hour. We're going to open it up to Discord chat under the one condition that, for whatever reason, it hasn't been working. I can figure out how to make it work.
Yeah.
But I guess before we pivot, because this is, you know, we did a birthday stream for Baudrillard, and that was one of the best things that we've done together. Absolutely. A lot of people still return to it. They'll let me know like way later. There's like I've been listening to that podcast again because I took it. So it was a live stream on the YouTube channel, theoryplebe/c/theoryplebe. Well, it also got uploaded to my podcast, which makes it available on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and anything that, you know, pulls off of Apple or Google Play. So basically it's available on, I think, any app you might use. So you can always just look up Theory Plebe. There's a bunch of crap there. Some of it's really old. I apologize. Some of it's really tacky, whatever. But that conversation, there's a few conversations on there that I treasure. And the one that we had on Baudrillard is right up there. And this one, I would say, is going to rank right up there as well. So it'll definitely get added to the podcast. And so in terms of closing out this segment, because we're not going to have the Q&A available on the podcast, you'd have to go, you know, join the Discord for that or whatever. But do you have any final closeout thoughts?
No, I just would say that a lot of people will tell you that Lacan is an obscurantist. I mean, people like Noam Chomsky will say, oh, he's bullshitting, he's bluffing, there's nothing really there. And just speaking for myself, I feel like he's one of the most important thinkers that I've ever read. I think his work is so rich in ideas. I think he has the greatest, most complicated, nuanced, thought-out theory of human subjectivity that any fellow human has ever produced. I think he totally can change and enlighten the way we think about politics, pop culture, film, art, etc., religion. I just think that he is, in my estimation, I think he's one of the most important thinkers that ever lived. And I admit it's a pain in the ass to get, you know, assimilated into his theoretical work, and there really is no easy way to do it. I've had to work at this more than any other thinker I've studied, and I've studied Heidegger and Deleuze and Baudrillard, and you know, they're very complicated. But I think Lacan is even more inaccessible to than they are because of how sprawling his seminar is. Remember, there's 20, depending on how you want to count it, there's 26 or 27 of these seminars. Most of them average 300 pages each, and they're just an ongoing project. So yeah, like a Cree, it's not even worth even reading any of that stuff because he even said those were not meant to be read, and he wrote them to be these texts that analysts struggle with to have to dig out their meaning. But you have to know what he's doing in the seminars to really approach the writings in the Acree, unless you get a good commentary on the writings in the Acree, and there's a lot of them nowadays. But I would just like to, you know, provide some recommendations.
Yeah, you do the recommendations, and I'm going to put the images of them up while you talk. I'll look them up. So I already know a couple. I'll get to work.
Okay, well, the first one, without question, is you need some basic familiarity with Freud. Everything Lacan's doing is a return to Freud, and his knowledge of Freud is encyclopedic.
he's basically read everything Freud ever wrote, and he's going to draw on that throughout the whole seminar. And that can be really intimidating. But I mean, I know with the popularity of Lacan, I mean, obviously you don't have to go read everything Freud wrote. You don't even have to read all of the you get a good secondary source, a good introductory text. There's one that I have. It's called, I think it's just called Sigmund Freud, and I believe it's by Jonathan Lear. And it's a good one to start with. So I would look around, find some good introductory texts on Freud. Maybe read Interpretation of Dreams, and I know it's a big book. So maybe just the summary lectures he gave on dreams. And
what's the Freud one you just recommended called again?
Which one, the secondary source or the book?
Yeah, the secondary source.
I believe it's called Sigmund Freud by Jonathan Lear. Last name Lear.
And you want to be careful where you get your Freud stuff from, because he's really he's a cliff note to most of these people. He's a historical oddity. I remember talking to one of my favorite professors, who was my psychology 101 professor. I loved the guy, great professor. But when I told him that I was getting excited about the Freud part of our class and that I wanted to read Freud now, he laughed and was like, "Don't bother." So it's like, unless you know what you're looking for or why you're doing it, like, people are just gonna be like, well, why are you doing that? So,
well, this will make you happy, right? So so the book is just called Freud, and it's in the Routledge Philosophers series, and it's by Jonathan Lear, and there's a blurb on the back of the book that'll make you happy. It says, if I were to answer the question, who among contemporary psychoanalysts is best qualified to write an introduction to Freud as a philosopher, my choice would be Jonathan Lear. Who said that? Slavoj Žižek.
Oh, good.
So this is the introduction to Freud that Žižek recommends.
It does make me happy to know. And I haven't read this, and so now it's way up on my... I'm not saying I need a PDF of it, but I would definitely love a PDF.
So here's the other thing. So Freud, he wrote so many great texts. I mean, you could spend a whole life just reading Freud. And again, I know that people act like it's not worth reading them, but it's a fundamental mistake. Freud was a towering genius, and he was wrapped up in certain presuppositions of his time. And because he was, I mean, it's one thing to say, like, think about it. It's Sartre, right? Sartre with being a nothingness. Sartre is making a contribution to philosophy, right? But he's not inventing philosophy. Freud was literally inventing a discourse, a field of inquiry that had never existed, right? It's like how Aristotle worked out the fundamental mechanisms of logic. I mean, what Freud did was, I mean, it's a paradigm shift in human thought, right? It's up there with Aristotle. It's up there with Newton, right? With physics, with Einstein, and
well, he's one of the masters of suspicion, according to Rick Roderick, right? It's Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, and then he says, well, maybe also Darwin. They're like the four who like shook the foundations of all of the modern assumptions.
And here's the thing. So this is, and I was going to touch on this earlier. So Freud is considered one of the easiest of the great thinkers to read, where Lacan's considered one of the hardest, if not the hardest, right? At least in this area of the thinkers that continental philosophy focuses on. And so it's strange that the guy who is doing this return to Freud is nearly impenetrable to read when Freud is highly accessible. But Lacan's style was not just some idiosyncratic preference or, I'm going to be an obscurantist, sound more profound than I really am. Maybe there's a little bit there sometimes. But what he was trying to counteract is that Freud, for him, was completely misunderstood by all of his followers. And for Lacan, it was precisely due to Freud's clarity, his lucidity, his accessibility as a writer, that made him so easily to misinterpret. someone like Heidegger, you really have to work at the text to start to get his ideas out of them, right? Or to see what he's phenomenologically describing. Freud seems so easy to read, and that's precisely why he lended himself to such misunderstanding. People would read it one time and think they got it, and they wouldn't pore over his text the way that we would pore over Deleuze or Levinas or Derrida, right?
And that's the thing, is once you learn how to read difficult texts as well, you underestimate some of the more simple ones and you brush through them pretty quick, which is also a problem with Žižek half the time. But
you have to read Interpretation of Dreams like it's being in time, and nobody does, and none of his followers did. They read it once and go, "Oh, I got that. I don't have to read that again." No, you didn't get that. Go back. And this is why Lacan was like, "I'm going to make my shit as hard as I can," so they have to struggle with it so they won't get it wrong. Now the problem is he was so difficult that, of course, it lent itself to misunderstanding. He went too far in the other direction sometimes. But, I mean, especially in the Acree. The seminars, here's what's difficult about okay, hold on, I'm going to hold up there because I got more recommendations, but we'll
I would only throw in the other piece is that he was practicing what he was preaching, and that's that you don't just give people what they immediately want. You gotta always hold back.
As an analyst, exactly. And that's exactly what he's doing. He wants us to work at understanding his writing, especially in the Acree, like how an analyst has to listen to an analysan's discourse, right? He's trying to use his writings as a way to train analysts for the work of analysis, and which requires all kinds of, you have to hear words on a multitude of levels. You don't hear them just on the surface level meaning. He's saying three things at once, and he's playing with language. There's all these turns of phrase, all this stuff that he's doing. So he's trying to use his writings in the Acree to do that. He'll obviously he makes these kind of neologisms and plays on words and all this stuff in the seminars, but the seminars are much more accessible. So before going on, I'll just say, at the bare minimum, get a good introduction to Freud, and I do recommend this one, especially since Žižek recommends it. And then read some Freud. It's hard for me to tell you which one because there's so many different topics. Like Civilization and Its Discontents is great because it's what he has to say about society as a whole. Totem and Taboo is important because it has the myth of the primal father, which if we do another episode or we come back and talk about Lacan more, we'll definitely have to get into that. But I would stick with the early stuff, like 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. That's a really good Freud text to start with. It's short, and it had a big impact on Lacan.
What's it called?
Say what?
What's it called again?
3 essays on the theory of sexuality.
Okay.
So that's a good one, and obviously Interpretation of Dreams, but that's you're going to invest a lot of time reading through that one. So you could read something like the little summary of it, which Freud wrote, called On Dreams, where you'll get the basic outline of it. So yeah, I'd start with something like that. And then, okay, when it comes to, somebody's going to say, yeah, but I want to read Lacan. And so the only recommendation I really have is Seminar 11. And it's without question his most influential seminar. It's the one that the vast majority of people start with. And for good reason. It was this moment in his thinking where so much started to click, and he started to diverge from some of his older ideas and really become this creative thinker. And Žižek uses page after page after page of 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, which is the name of Seminar 11. He uses so much of Seminar 11 throughout his work. So if you say, you know what, I want to read Lacan, I want to struggle with it until I can say, hey, I at least kind of know what this guy is talking about, I would say start with Seminar 11. Here's the difficulty you're going to encounter. One, besides just the way Lacan talks and the terminology he uses, you also have to remember there's been 10 years of this seminar. There's 10 years of context behind this thing. And so without that context, you're obviously not going to be able to go, oh, I see what he's doing. He's doing something new here, or he hasn't done this before, or he's modifying this old idea. But you know what? I say take like the Hegelian approach, which is just fail and then fail better and then fail even better than the last failure and keep doing it. And then sooner or later you'll go, okay, I am starting to get what he's doing. And so like those are the primary texts, right? Like, of course you got to read some Freud and you got to read Lacan, but say, okay, this is what I recommend. I honestly recommend holding off on reading Lacan until you've read some good introductory material on his work. That's how I did it. I'm only now, years later, really starting to be able to read Lacan and, you know, make sense of what he says on his own. So the primary introductions that I recommend are Lionel Bailey's book just called Lacan. This one is really helpful. It's one of the first ones I read.
I have that one up on the reel. If you look at the reel, I have like these books that are, it shows one, then it shows the other, so it cycles through them, and Lionel Bailey's is up on there.
So one of the best things, besides Bailey just being very clear, is he provides a glossary in the back of the book. So he provides definitions of terms like castration, other, phallus, desire, méconnaissance, mere stage, sexuation, right? And these definitions might not help a lot at first, but if you keep returning to them and rereading them, they will illuminate a lot as you develop your understanding. Another basic introduction that I recommend is called Jacques Lacan, and it's in the Routledge Critical Thinkers series, and the author is Sean Homer. It's a really good introductory text. There was three that I started off with initially, and these are two of them. So yeah, Lionel Bailey, Sean Homer, and then Žižek's short book, How to Read Lacan. And
oh yeah, got to get that one.
Yeah, the first time I read that, this is easily Žižek's best, most accessible introduction to Lacan. And the good thing about it is, you know, look, Žižek is 50% Lacanian, 50% Hegelian. So he's always connecting Lacan to Hegel. And it's hard enough to figure out what Lacan is talking about, let alone, oh, you're connecting his ideas to somebody else who's like one of the hardest thinkers to understand. So what's great about How to Read Lacan is that it's just him focusing on Lacan. There's very little, if any, Hegelian stuff explicitly discussed in that book. And those are the three I started off with. They laid my basic foundation, and I still recommend those. Now, if you work through those and those are all starting to click, then I recommend taking it up a notch, right? And this would involve reading Bruce Fink's books and some of Žižek's other books. And so there's two books by Bruce Fink. This guy is, like, he was a godsend. This guy is a trained analyst, and he was the first American, I think, who really wrote books on Lacan that really illuminated Lacan's thinking. And so there's one that's the more philosophical, theoretical work, and it's called The Lacanian Subject. And there's a second one, which is the more clinical work, and it's called A Clinical Introduction to Lacanian Psychoanalysis. And these two books are absolutely invaluable to me. I've read each of them, I think, 3 times, and I always return to various passages from them. And you know, here's the thing. We didn't get to it tonight, and I'm not sure we'll even get to it next time, but one of the hardest things in Lacan to understand is the clinical structures, and that's the neurotic, and the neurotic can either be the obsessional neurotic or the hysteric. Then you also have the pervert, and then you also have the psychotic. And trying to understand these clinical structures, as Lacan puts them, is one of the hardest things, but Bruce Fink by far gives the best introduction to the clinical structures. And the point is, if you're an analyst and you're having to deal with an obsessional or with a hysteric or with a pervert or with a psychotic, you have to approach the analysis in a radically different way. And you have to do different things with these different types of patients. And Bruce Fink's book is the best one I've found on that by far. And then, okay, another one by Fink that I would recommend is called Lacan on Love. And what's cool about this one is this is his commentary on Seminar 8, which is the seminar on transference. And this seminar is famous for its discussion of Plato's Symposium, and it brings out this idea called the agama, which many Lacanians interpret as it's almost like sketching out objet petit a. It's like laying the groundwork for the concept of objet petit a. And Bruce Fink's commentary is just amazing on Seminar 8. And so I would also recommend that. And then again, if you don't want to start with Seminar 11, maybe start with Seminar 8 and you use Lacan on Love. You know, you have a commentary to actually read along with it. So that would be one approach.
Okay, I love this. This is, I mean, I've heard it from you before. It's just so overwhelming, folks. No one in the chat except for that one person who likes to do the hardest thing in the world. No one else is like, okay, fuck yeah, I'm gonna read all these books. But I hope that everyone listening, that out of all those descriptions, one of those sticks with you and it's enough to pick up. You don't have to. So for me,
I'm thinking options.
I never picked up Lionel Bailey planning on reading all of that shit. And I did have a basic rudimentary idea of Freud before going into that, thankfully.
Yep.
But, you know, you're always in the thick of it. There is no one right place to begin. We don't know your journey, but we are going to turn to your questions in a second. So let's, and by the way, there's one fucking lecture, I think, where they actually recorded Lacan talking, and it gives you a realization that this guy's a performer. This guy knows how to fucking hold an audience in captivity. Like, not just like this is not a captive audience. These are not students that are here for credit. Well, some of them maybe, but these are professors and statesmen. These are people who
other great philosophers.
Yeah, Derrida's in this audience. You know, like
Sorry, I think they all were there at one point.
Like pre-acid trip, Guattari is sitting there taking notes. You know, and so we've got a bunch of big brain people at the altar of this big brain, you know, person, and you know, they all disagree with him in their own ways, but you can't understand how or why they actually do it without, you know, getting to him first. And then even and that's the thing about French people, like whenever, you know, the theorists anyway, whenever they critique, you always give them like, I'm always skeptical of their critiques. Like, does this really hit the mark, or are they just talking shit about people who are into this person? Which is usually they just don't like, you know, it's not Heidegger, it's Heideggerians. You know, they don't have a problem with Derrida. Right. They have a problem with the way Derridians or Hegelians talk about the thinker that they're reading, and that's just this fucking academia bullshit. But these are public lectures that he was doing, and that's why he had all these professors in attendance. And also, by the way, Sartre fucking was seeing crabs, and so he was having like all these issues, and so Sartre went through an analysis with Lacan for a hot minute, even though he was never really into psychoanalysis. So
yeah. Yeah, it's funny he went through it, because in Being in Nothingness, he totally rejects he doesn't even believe the unconscious is a real thing, and so it's you want to go, what are you even doing there? But I don't know. It's just funny.
Sartre doesn't believe in the unconscious because he doesn't want people to have you better live with no excuses, and the unconscious sounds like too much of an excuse to him.
Yeah, basically, yeah, but it's sorry, man, you've got an unconscious. I hate to break it to you. Like, it's almost with Sartre. Again, it's a French form of it, but we've talked about it before, where the French have a really strong impulse towards freedom and liberty. It's something we share with them. Americans do it in a totally different way. But Sartre wanted to act like, you know, he was, you know, his concept of freedom is so free that if you know psychoanalysis, or even Heidegger, right? Because Heidegger puts so much emphasis on thrownness and facticity. And like Sartre gives formal recognition to facticity, but it's almost like, okay, I gave it its formal recognition, but I'm all about transcendence for the most part. Anyway, that's kind of, so I think I'll just say the last thing I want to recommend for people who don't want to read books, who would much prefer to get their theory in the form of a podcast, there is an amazing podcast called Why Theory. And it's hosted by Todd McGowan and Ryan Ingley. And on every episode, these two are Hegelian, Lacanian Hegelian, just like Žižek. And this podcast is by far my favorite theory/philosophy podcast. Todd McGowan, it's a big statement, but I think of him as he's the American Žižek. He's written some books that I haven't even read all of them because I only recently got familiarized with his work. I wish I would have known about him years ago. But he's doing these kind of Hegelian interpretations of capitalism like Žižek, but he's pointing out the things that he thinks are important. It's not just recycled Žižek. And yet it's if you like Žižek, you will love these books. So one of them's called The End of Dissatisfaction, and another one's called Capitalism and Desire. And so those books I highly recommend. But again, if you're not into reading books and you just want to get your theory in the form of podcasts, then definitely check out Why Theory. They actually just did an episode on coronavirus and its impacts, so that would be a great source to get a basic understanding of Lacan. Because I mean, they have an episode on desire and drive. They have an episode on political enjoyment. I mean, the master signifier. So you'll get a lot of the basic concepts from them.
Fucking killer. All right, we're not going to raid out just this moment, but we are going to say thank you. Everybody in all the chats, wherever you are in a chat, go ahead and give it up. Say thank you. It's been so good to have you. So,
yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast. You and I, we do this. We could do this for 7 hours, but it's a good idea to wrap this up now.
We have too. And you talk about it, you listen to it enough, eventually it starts to sink in more than you realize. Like for me, I am a Lacanian in this fucking way that is kind of bullshit, because it's like I didn't choose to be a Lacanian. I've had so many conversations about it. I keep thinking about it. I keep looking at things that way. It's like you can't think about, once you've been there, you can't think about reality without the registers that Lacan's working with. This is why gender theory is so tied into the three registers, the symbolic, the real, and this is why Butler is, stays reliant on it. This is why, and so many really big names,
right? Aggressivity, right? Yeah,
exactly. She's a huge Lacanian, and gets, basically like a lot of Judith Butler's main disagreements with Luce Irigaray, or however you say it. A lot of her big disagreements there are about how we inherit Lacan, and so Butler's like, yeah, well, you think about Lacan this way, but I think about it this way because I'm using Foucault and Nietzsche in these ways. And so when you do check out my podcast, there's also like a 6-part on gender trouble, and I stand by it at this point. I haven't gone back to it in a while, so maybe I'll retract my statement later and I'll be like, I don't stand by it, and I'll take it down. But for the time being, I'm pretty sure. No, that was a good pass. That was my second time through gender trouble, and my conception of the cis hetero normative matrix of intelligibility comes right out of gender trouble. But it's really it comes along with this Lacanian stuff that I had to really, like, before going back to gender trouble, because I tried to read it a couple of times. Before going back to gender trouble, I spent more time with Lacan, the secondary texts that are on the screen and stuff like that. And so I do bring some of that in. We don't spend a lot of time on that, but we talk about some of these rudimentary basics in the context of gender there. And I know some of the Sower was in the chat talking about gender and how this seems like it would be useful for that. So that's why it would be useful for that. Also, thank you, I Am Object, for sharing the link to Why Theory in our chat. I don't know if the folks on Twitch or YouTube got that, but listen, if you're on Twitch or YouTube, this stream's going to go on for at least another half hour. I'm going to be playing Doom Eternal, but really quick, we're going to find out if we're able to open up the Discord chat. So if you wanted to just ask your question directly, this is the time to hop in there. Lampe usually hops in. So whoever wants to hop into the Discord general chat, Mikey, you're gonna want to try to get in there again. So, and then if you're, tell you what, let's just plan like 3 minutes right now. If we don't have that thing working in 3 minutes, then you can just finish out responding to whatever questions you wanted to that got asked in the guest lecture thing. And don't forget, everybody, the saying always overflows the said, right? We'll never get to the end of the conversation. We're always on our way there. We're never there yet. So.
Exactly. Well, hey, thanks for having me on, and I've absolutely enjoyed discussing Lacan. And since we only scratched the surface, we should come back in a week or so and flesh it out some more.
God, I'd love to do that. I would love that. All right, yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Okay.
It's a day later. I'm still in the afterglow of that wonderful lecture. That is the stuff I live for. Whether it's me doing the whole thing on my own or working in tandem with someone else, that is the kind of engagement, that is the kind of learning that I come alive for. I love it. It gives my life meaning and purpose. And I just wanted to say thank you to the people over here, the patrons who are making it possible. A couple have already migrated to my new website without me saying that they should do so. They deleted their Patreon pledges and went and subscribed to my personal website. I haven't given the order or put forward an ask on Patreon for people who are already my patrons to do that. A lot of people are used to being on Patreon, and if they come over to my website, like, well, just even asking, it's just like, it might be easier just to keep, if you're already a patron for other people, just to stay on the website. That's fine. But we do have to be exploring alternative means of content creation, education, and organizing. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to do after my YouTube termination. It just seems important. But also because I like the infinite customization potential. Okay, I really like the idea that I'll be able to upload courses to my website that'll be like on Skillshare, except just on my website. You'll be able to unlock that as a patron. You'll be able to unlock special emotes in the chat. There's a lot of really cool features that will come with having my own website. So if you are thinking about becoming a patron, if you're thinking about donating through PayPal, whatever, I am over the next month and a half here probably, migrating everything and centralizing everything over towards my website, because Jeff Bezos takes 3 out of every $5. YouTube has never cut me a check, so I've demonetized all of my YouTube videos, and I am trying to cancel affiliate with Twitch. Hopefully that works soon. But I loved being a Twitch affiliate, and so I loved the emotes that it gave me, the community, the people who play with it. There's a whole like gamification of the streaming platform that comes with being an affiliate, and there's like a mark of pride that comes with being an affiliate, and then you can become a partner if you level up. And I was really looking at leveling up as a partner, but then the more I thought about it, the more I thought I don't want to be constrained to Twitch. 3 out of $5 is just ridiculous. And they denied one of my emotes that I wanted to get approved. And maybe this sounds a little petty, but I took it pretty seriously, because like they don't allow political emotes. But here I was using this one. Check it out on screen right here. See that? Normie socialism with Bernie's face laughing. I tried to get that approved for 2 weeks, and then they finally just denied it without any explanation besides like citing their rules. And if you look at the rules, it says no political stuff, but you do have people with political stuff on there. And so what I'm working on now is pulling all of this together. all of these different emotes, putting them into different tiers. I want to have a ton of different emotes that are going to be available for free. If you're like, I'm into philosophy, what are emotes? Emotes are like stickers. Like, I get it. If you don't think that these are fun to use in chat or whatever, then great. But look at this, Timenergy, clip and ship emote. Like these are things that I've been working on, that I just can't wait for us to be able to use. Look, here's me canceled. Hold on, let's make it larger. Hold on, we gotta get the right one. I think there's a larger one. No, there's no larger one. I can't show you that one. Anyway, these are fun. I can't wait to really expand, and we're gonna have a lot of fun, and we're gonna learn a lot. And so stay tuned. Don't forget, there's a weekly thing on Saturdays right now, where I am learning statistics. So if you were here for this, you'll be there for that. You'll love that too. I mean, I can totally see why you'd be like, continental philosophy, statistics, I don't see the overlap. Yeah, we're looking at statistics within the context of the political and economics, so I think that you might like it. Cool. Thanks for your support. Bye-bye.